All right, good evening. Tuesday, June 13th. Tonight is our study session. Calling this meeting to order, and we'll have our city clerks.
Recording in progress.
Whoop, no, it's okay. Are we good? Okay, we'll have our city clerk start with our roll call.
Mayor Kaylee Clark.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Amy Lamb.
Here.
Councilmember Karen Howe.
Here.
Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Ratuja Ndapure.
Here.
Councilmember Roshino Farrow.
Here.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Treen, can you lead us in the pledge? Great, thank you. I'll read our land acknowledgement this evening. We acknowledge that we are on the indigenous land of Coast Salish peoples who have reserved treaty rights to this land, specifically the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. All right, first up, I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded. Any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, no executive session, right? Woo. Okay. Councilmember O'Farrell, if you will read our proclamation for Juneteenth.
Thank you, Mayor. Proclamation, Juneteenth, June 19th, 2023. Whereas we acknowledge on June 19, 1865, the last group of enslaved African Americans were informed of their liberation in Texas 2.5 years after the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation. And whereas in order that we may never forget the evils of slavery and its aftermath, we acknowledge the injustices and suffering African Americans experienced under slavery. And whereas Juneteenth serves as a holiday to reflect on our nation's history, commemorate emancipation, and look toward the future impact of Black culture and community. And whereas to promote racial healing, reconciliation, and justice, it is important to recognize the significance of Juneteenth and continue engaging in dialogue on race relations. And whereas during this Juneteenth event, we appreciate the African American experience and celebrate the inclusion of all races, ethnicities, and nationalities as we commit to working together towards equitable experiences and opportunities for all those in our community. Now, therefore, Mayor Kaylee Clark of the City of Sammamish and on behalf of the Sammamish City Council do hereby proclaim June 19, 2023 to be Juneteenth 2023 in the City of Sammamish, and I encourage all to join in the celebration.
Great, thank you so much. All right, first up, David Pyle, Land Use and Housing Alternatives for the 2024 Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update. I think we have Evan and then Jeff from Framework. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor. David Pyle, Department of Community Development. Tonight we have, as stated, Jeff Arango with Framework. And we have a presentation for you. Then we're hoping to have a conversation with the council about some of the land use and housing alternatives that are presented in the agenda bill. This is really a check-in point for us on this process as we start to narrow down the alternatives that will be carried forward as we develop housing and land use strategies for the comp plan. And it's not necessary that we nail down the numbers tonight specifically, more so that we understand the concepts and that we're ready to come back and have further conversation around the exact numbers. We'd like to try to narrow them down. However, we do understand that this is a really big topic and we're ready to answer questions and keep working on it. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thank you, David. Good evening, Mayor, City Council members. Jeff Arango with Framework, and I am going to share my screen and go through our presentation. Okay. So as David said, tonight is a discussion on land use alternatives, and we have several different sections we're going to be going through, presenting, again, some of the data that forms the background of the development of alternatives at this point, some of the policy background and guidance from the state and regional planning entities, and then some of the recent legislation and some options for compliance there. So our meeting objectives, we want to review our assessment of local housing needs and opportunities. We want to review updated land use strategies based on the recent legislation, which we previewed at the last meeting that I was in attendance. Really important, we want to understand the relationship between growth targets, affordable housing allocation, population projection, and development capacity, and I'll go through those definitions here in a moment. We want to review the affordable housing allocation and our strategy for achieving that. And we're looking for input from the council at key points tonight. We're looking for input on the land use alternatives for the comprehensive plan update, input on the middle housing types that are required for compliance with House Bill 1110, which is the middle housing bill. Input on whether we should plan now for the 75,000 population threshold, which kicks in some additional requirements in HB 1110, and then input on the draft future land use map. We had a great workshop a couple weeks ago with the city staff covering a number of topics, but among them was the future land use map and trying to make that more of a useful planning tool as opposed to a copy of the zoning map. So we'll present some thinking on that as well. So just a quick reminder that everything we're discussing tonight should really feed into the vision. Our theme for the project is Planet, People, and Prosperity. So I want to think about how we can support those kind of three themes along with the 10 kind of big ideas that are embedded into the vision statement. So for example, how can our land use plans support our climate action plan goals, our goals for fiscal sustainability, and our goals for creating a city that creates, lots of social and cultural opportunities, among other things. And just a quick reminder, this comprehensive planning cycle is really unlike others that I've been a part of in that there's just so many different overlapping mandates and requirements. And I just wanted to reiterate that we have a relatively narrow timeline and commend the city for getting started early, but we have a relatively narrow timeline listed in one over on the far left-hand side of the graph there to develop the basic plan and strategies. And we have 20 years or so for implementation, for refinement, for monitoring. So those are really key parts of the process. We want to get it right during the planning process, but we know there's going to be refinements along the way given the magnitude of some of the planning challenges we're trying to tackle. So we'd like to start with a couple of terms that are really foundational to the Growth Management Act and to planning. And sometimes these terms are used synonymously for obvious reasons, but they do have very different implications. So the first is the growth target. When we say growth target, we're generally referring to the amount of population growth that was given to us in the number of units from King County. That number is 2,100. That is the amount that we must plan for. So when we say we must plan for, that means that we must demonstrate that our parks programs, our capital facilities, our transportation system can accommodate that amount of growth. If we can't, we either have to revise those plans or revise our land use plan. So that's when we refer to generally the growth target, that's that number. And we also need to show that we have the capacity to get that development in the city in terms of whole numbers. And as you know, right now, the city's capacity is, I think, just a little bit under that by some accounts. So that's kind of the first piece. The second one, which is new this year, is the affordable housing allocation. So in past years, you just get a bucket of units and you needed to accommodate that. Now we have to accommodate them specifically by affordability, and the affordability has implications for certain housing types. You're not going to meet your 0 to 30% AMIs with single family homes. So it gets into much more nuance of not only do you have to have the amount of capacity, but you have to have the capacity in the right places in order for that to work. So that's when we talk about affordable housing allocation, that's the 2,100 units broken down by income band. The next one is the population projection. And this is a term used in the Growth Management Act. And this is also the amount you're planning for. This population projection could be your growth target. It could be the same number, or it could be something else. The city, Sammamish or any other city, is not required to plan for more growth than the growth target. That would be a local decision. And there's some guidance that we've received from King County about that we're going to share in a few moments. So we do have the opportunity to increase it. It is a local decision. It can be informed by data, but I can tell you there is not a magic formula that we can put together and it'll spit out that perfect number. And I'll explain that, why that is in a few moments. But I think the trends are really clear, and I think some of the causes of the trends are really clear. We don't have a lot of housing diversity because we don't allow a lot of housing diversity. It really is, I think, that simple. There are some allowances for certain housing types that are allowed that haven't been used. It was exciting to see David share a plan for some duplex units. So I think there are some dynamics that we can change there, but largely we've been producing, one type of housing. So that's the population projection. And that population projection needs to be consistent throughout your plan. You can't say we're planning for 2,100 units in our land use, and then in the capital facilities, we're using another number, and here we're using another number. That's when you get your plan invalidated for being inconsistent. And the last one is development capacity. So that's how much could theoretically happen in terms of development. That would include accounting for things like a market factor. Every property is not for sale. Critical areas, properties that are already developed and not likely to redevelop, so on and so forth. Your development capacity can far exceed or just slightly exceed your growth target or your population projection. So we've been working with a number of cities and a number of different counties, so we've gotten to kind of see, where the different cities are in terms of capacity and their growth targets, and in some cases it's many, many times. So there isn't necessarily a real strong relationship between your growth target and capacity, and so that is something that is another lever that we can pull from. So even if our capacity is, say, 10,000 units, we're really only basing our plan on the growth target or the population projection, if that makes sense. So for those of you or those in the community that are advocating for more growth and more housing opportunity, some of the way that you can address that is in the capacity, even if you're not including it in your plan. Now, I would also suggest that you want to be monitoring that, because if you start to outpace your growth, which we have worked with cities that have done that, you want to go back and make sure you're not creating traffic, headaches or transportation issues or capital facility, limitations. So there is provisions under GMA to sort of rethink things if your assumptions are not accurate. Okay, so now here's the question that was posed to King County that David shared with us. And basically it's this question: can I plan for more housing than in my target? And the response is jurisdictions can plan for more capacity than their target, but the comprehensive plan should be based on the growth, essentially based on the adopted housing target. So what they're saying is your capacity can be bigger, but when you base your capital facilities plan, your transportation plan, you really should do it on the growth target. They cite risk of inconsistencies with the CPCs not being consistent with Vision 2050, and land use assumptions need to be substantially consistent. Now, in my professional experience, I think it would be problematic to only look at the growth target, right? Because we know that we need, in some cases, some additional market rate units in order to provide sort of offsets or incentives for the affordable units. It's not our entire strategy, but it is a key part of it. And so if we don't allow for that to happen through our planning, or we start to overshoot the 2,100 units, that seems like not a very logical way to go. So, so we could do that a couple of different ways. We could theoretically keep the growth target, or keep our, basis of the plan at the growth target, but kind of focus more on the capacity piece of it. But again, I think there's some risk in not having your sort of functional plans, supporting the actual growth you're going to need to see. So in that respect, the growth target or the population projection is really just an assumption. It's really an assumption. Sometimes these different assumptions aren't even backed by different policy directions. They're just simply different assumptions. And so we want to be, I think, as accurate as possible for what we're sort of planning for. So hopefully that makes sense. I'd be happy to answer more questions on that. So I think our takeaway here is, I think we could make a case for more growth than the growth target because of the need to produce affordable housing. You know, if we stick with the 2100 and we don't get any affordable housing because of the limitations that we placed on that, then we're going to find ourselves in a challenging position anyways. So it would be my advice to kind of make the case now for at least what we would need to achieve the affordable housing. But with that said, it's a local policy decision.
One thing I want to add to this is if you notice the last two sentences, be mindful, the jurisdiction should avoid increasing capacity in a pattern inconsistent with the regional growth strategy. So you'll note later when we talk about the future land use map that any of the proposed capacity changes that we're looking at have been done with a mind to the regional growth strategy and some of the recent legislation we've seen with regard to walkability, with regard to potential existing or future service by transit. So when we're looking at adding capacity, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, we're really considering regional growth strategies and some of the additional planning requirements that go along with adding capacity. But the one thing to keep in mind is that, and I think it's bolded at the top, comprehensive plan should be based on the adopted housing growth target. So that, again, we can't stress that enough. I would suggest, and I'll send this out to you all tomorrow, printing this out and keeping this as a touchstone to use as we work through this comp plan, because this, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle for us. Thank you.
I mean, if it's something really specific to something, I think it'd be easier to take a question now.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
Thanks, sorry. So I see what's on the page, but we all know that this isn't real, right? Because of Sammamish's situation where King County has said all of the housing growth target must be affordable, and we know that that's not going to happen unless there's market rate housing. And if we put 2100 in our comp plan, but we know that some number greater than that is going to actually be built, then we are planning to fail.
So I would add to that the 2100 was already put in our comp plan by King County through the CPP amendment.
Right.
So we are required to follow that. However, I think what Jeff was alluding to and what this is saying is that we can plan for land capacity that exceeds the target. So
Yes, but my question is, so if we can plan for the land capacity, but all of the other things, school capacity numbers, parks, everything else, if it uses the 2100 number, but there's going to be some number bigger than that to make sure we get 2100 affordable units built, we are, by definition, planning to fail, are we not?
based on the current structure of growth management planning, whereby we are required to monitor and revisit, and I think Jeff mentioned this also in his presentation, that we need to be mindful to design a comp plan that requires reporting, that we're able to then check in on where we stand with regard to delivery of services as growth comes on board. That enables us to be reactive and to correct as needed. And that's also where we talk about the short runway that we're on to 2024, but the 20-year planning horizon that we're on from 2024 to 2044. During that time frame, there are multiple things that happen. There's reporting on housing units. There's reporting on infrastructure. We redo capital plans. The school district does its capital plans every year. We revisit our capital plans. So all of those things are happening. And if it's coordinated, in theory, it should result in adequate capacity as development comes online. There's also funding to think about and whether or not that's available. There's a whole host of things. So I would say that so long as we have the land capacity evaluated in what would be needed to accommodate those units in the comp plan, then we would be planning for success. The problem that we're left with is one that we didn't create.
And I wasn't blaming you. I'm just saying that it just doesn't make sense. Like the stormwater, right, or the water and sewer district, right? They're going to update their numbers based on our updated comp plan, right? We just had that discussion. And the number they're going to use is going to be the 2,100 number, not the land capacity number, right?
Correct.
And so they're only going to plan for 2,100 units for the next 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, to David's point, there is, frequently, regular updates to the comp plan and monitoring. So you could make a change then, and there will be another periodic update in 10 years. So it's not like we would have to wait the 10 years. But I think this is a big strategy decision for the city. And, we're kind of presenting two options. Alternative one is capped at the growth target. Alternative two is some measure higher. So those are the things that we're going to have to work through as part of the alternatives process. And it might be worth, having some more conversations with King County and PSRC, because I will say that, this is all new. And although folks are writing guidance for it, no one's actually done this before. So, I think there is definitely a learning experience and something that we want to continue to stay in the conversation about.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Councilmember Trine?
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to clarify there then that, at least from what I understand from Vision 2050, is that we're challenged immensely by the fact that 2,100 have to be affordable housing units, and then those units need to be adjacent or close to or in some proximity to transit. And sitting on the East Side Transportation Board, I mean, transit's not coming to Sammamish. So at least not till maybe after 2050. So I don't want people to be misguided or making assumptions that then become inaccurate, knowing full well that the infrastructure has to be concurrent with the development that's going to go on within the city. So if I'm missing anything there, I'd like to be corrected, but I think your point here is that we have to be, as a council, mindful that there is, well, here, answer this question. Is Vision 2050 a law that we have to follow?
A plan that we have to show alignment with our comprehensive plan. So in essence, a law you have to follow, because we do require certification from PSRC, who holds the keys to Vision 2050.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
So just going back to that line you were talking about, comprehensive plan should be based on the adopted housing growth target. So I just want to be really clear. So in the comp plan, it's going to say that we're going to plan for 2,100, right? And so, but we have room for all this other. So doesn't it create sort of this strange gray area? At least it does for me. Like, I don't know, like, what the city is actually going to be planning for, or anybody else, to Councilmember House or Councilmember Stewart's point. Like, it just seems like it's so gray. Like, so transportation, and what about our roads? Like, how do we plan for that? Are we planning for 5,000, or are we planning for 2,000?
We would be planning for 2,100, right, to the 2,000.
Yeah.
Because it's the growth target. However, we would also include analysis around land capacity that exceeds targets, or a population projection that exceeds the target. And that's our choice to do so. But it does create that tension in the plan around what are you actually planning for. And it's something that we're working really hard to try and unwind. As Jeff said, this is not something that we've had to do before. And all of the other cities are asking the same questions. We're a little bit ahead of most cities at this point in time. So we're trying to figure it out early so that we have adequate time. If the answer is one that we don't like, we can figure out how to navigate through that. So we will continue to work on this issue. I think the other challenge, if it wasn't challenging enough, is that we also have to demonstrate, using the Department of Commerce guidance, that we are planning for, accommodating, and removing barriers to delivery of 2,100 units of affordable housing allocation below 80% AMI. And to do that, we have to show that the math works. And to show that the math works, we have to first show that we're incentivizing it then look to partnerships, and then finally look to funding if the city wants to fund it. One way to think about it is that the city has two bookends to work off of. On the one hand, you could add a lot of capacity to the city to show that you're incentivizing it through market rate units in order to allow for development to pay for those affordable units. That's on one side. On the other side of the equation, the city could choose to pay for the affordable housing and build it ourselves. And between those two bookends are multiple iterations and versions whereby you look to partnerships, whereby you look to different unit types. However, unless the city is willing to step in and fund all of the affordable housing units that are required to be built, we are required to demonstrate by using the Department of Commerce guidance and methodology to the Puget Sound Regional Council for certification that we can reasonably show how the affordable units will be built. So the conundrum that we're left with is that we have a 2,100 unit growth target. All 2,100 units are in the of our allocation are in the 0 to 80% AMI, 80% and below, and we have to find a way to show the math. So not to steal Jeff's next slide, which I think he's getting to, but I think that is a really important point that I want to make sure we pay attention to as we progress. So sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, no, any background that you can provide is super helpful.
We do still have questions.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Councilmember Howe?
Sorry.
It's actually not a question, it's more of a comment, and I'm just trying to see if I understand this correctly. I think the way that I look at this is I can compartmentalize. And so for the very necessary and early ramp that we must hit, the 2,100, let's, to get the design work and figure that out now for that, and hold the next phase of it, because it'll evolve over time. See, I'm comfortable with ambiguity. I live there. And so I'm fine with taking our time, because I think things are going to change as the PSRC understands more and Department of Commerce understands more over time. That we may have some tweaks that come along that actually impact our decision making as we go ahead. So if we can compartmentalize and do the stuff we have to do first, and then hold out there our capacity component and understanding how we want to shape it. For example, I want to invest money, big bucks, in buying land or doing something that actually activates our low-income housing, which is a huge investment. Now, to get the political will to do that is gonna take time. It'll take years. So I need that mush. I need the ambiguity in order to promote and further that notion of we have to invest. If we want this to happen, then we need to do that, and it takes time. So that's my stump speech, and I will turn off my mic.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So it takes so long to do a road project, to plan for a road project. It takes years and years. So it's not like something we can just flip. So I do think that planning for the right number now is really important. So, which is why I think a lot of us are kind of hung up on, what is the right number to plan for?
So if I understand this correctly, we cannot change the 2,100.
We can what?
We cannot change 2,100, so we are going to carry on. And at some point, David Pyle is going to call us immediately once we can start bumping that up. That's my guess. I mean, obviously, this council was a lot different when we voted on 2,100 as well, and we cannot change that now, is my understanding.
Right. I mean, I do think there is maybe some opportunity to have some conversation again around some of the market rate housing that again supports the affordable housing production. Again, no one has done this before, so I think there is maybe some room for that conversation. But yes, the 2,100 unit is fixed, and we do have to accommodate that. The other piece to Councilmember Howe's point is, we wouldn't really necessarily have an issue until we got to approaching like 2,000 new units, which will take some time. So it wouldn't necessarily be an immediate issue. And again, we're hoping to help, set up a dashboard that, you know exactly what's going on with units and housing production, and nothing is a surprise, and you can, pivot and make changes as needed. So anyways, we're still working through it, but those are the challenges that, we're obviously facing in terms of, coming up with compliance, but also something that I think we can all feel like is somewhat realistic that we're trying to achieve, so.
Did you have something else?
I did.
Councilmember Stewart?
Actually, I had two things. One is that we have to show our math. We have to show that we have a plan to be able to build 2,100 affordable homes. And if we can only build a total of 2,100 units, then whatever we try to show them, I'm assuming the people at PSRC are smart enough to say that ain't going to work, right? If there's no market rate, then it's not going to work. And the second part is that when it comes to our impact fees and what we can collect from developers, if we are only planning for 2,100, then we can only charge them impact fees for a road project to accommodate traffic for an additional 2,100 homes. So if we do this in these stages and we say, well, we'll just start with 2,100 and then we'll bump it up later, we're only going to collect a small fraction of the money from the developers that is actually going to be needed to build out the infrastructure that we actually need to build. So again, we're really planning to fail on multiple levels. The schools won't be planning for the appropriate number. The water and sewer won't be planning for the appropriate number. And we won't be planning our roads or being able to charge developers the appropriate rate for the roads that are really required. So I think I kind of take it differently, that right now we have this mandate, and that as elected officials, we need to go talk to some of our counterparts at King County and ask them, well, how do you guys propose we make this work? Because in the real world, this doesn't. Thanks.
Back? Okay. Thank you for all those questions. So now we're going to go through the inputs that we use to come up with the 5,500 number, which again is a local choice and really a policy decision more than an analytical result, and I'll demonstrate why that is here in a moment. So this is the first input is the GMA mandate, which is the growth target and the affordable housing allocation. We also look at local housing needs and really what we're calling opportunities, because I think we see a lot of opportunities to address the known local housing needs. In cases where the local need was less than the affordable housing allocation, we just went with the affordable housing allocation. So for example, in the 0 to 30, we'd have to find a local need higher than 1449 in order for that number to change. So just to give you a sense of how we did that. And there are a couple categories where we did do that. And then for local housing needs, we looked at housing affordability gap by income band, just locally, which again, the regional allocation is more about regional needs. So just understand that this data is more compartmentalized within the city. We looked at workforce housing needs, so those that are commuting into Sammamish to work, which is 86% of the workforce. And then the housing unit size and household size mismatches, right? So we have some bigger units, more bigger units than is aligned with the sizes of our households. Okay, so now we're going to go into the results of that. And just a reminder, these are some of the topics we're going to ask questions on. We have question slides after each section, although there isn't one after this first one. So local housing needs, again, there's a significant mismatch between unit sizes and household sizes. We have a dearth of smaller 1 and 2 bedroom units. We did define one area of potential disparate impact in the form of racial exclusion and potential displacement within Kalahani. And then the majority of cost burden households from our analysis are more than 100% AMI, including a deficit in market rate housing to meet local needs. And so I'll go through some of that now, but first I want to start with some of the limitations. So the analysis identifies clear indicators for local housing needs, which I just identified, but again, it's different to assess the range of factors that determines people's housing preferences and needs. So for example, and there's some gaps in the data I want to recognize. So for example, we can look at workforce housing incomes, but housing costs are based on household incomes. So therefore, someone could, a category could show up as low household or low income, but that we don't know what their household income is. So that could, that's kind of a data gap. Household size, the unit size analysis doesn't consider personal housing preferences. I can use my own mother as an example. She's in her 70s and lives alone in a large house. Doesn't seem to have any desire to move to a smaller unit. I also think because of all the housing changes that have happened during COVID, even if you've owned your house for a while, I think the attractiveness or economic benefit of downsizing is maybe less though than it was. So that is to say, even though the data will tell us some trends, it's difficult to again parse that out, like how many do we actually need, right? So we've tried to apply some basic assumptions to create opportunity, but just understand that it's difficult to know, again, some of the personal preferences. It really is about opportunity, and I think we have a lot of opportunity to diversify Sammamish's housing stock, including implementing HB 1110, which is the middle housing bill, but also looking at some increased housing in the centers for affordable and market rate housing. Again, the last bullet is really, I think, somewhat of a debate. We can at least have more capacity than our growth target. Whether we can plan for it or not, I think is an open question. But again, I still think we need to be cautious of over-planning because of all the risks that were identified in the FAQ from King County that we just went through. So this is just a summary table that shows some of the analysis that we described. The housing unit and household size mismatch, again, surplus of 3 and 4 bedroom units and a dearth of 1 and 2 bedroom units. So essentially in that, it's like, well, how many smaller units should we plan for, right? And again, there's some overlap because some of the affordable housing units might be small. Some of the affordable workforce housing might be, smaller units. So again, there's some overlap in how this is done. We also, under the second one, combined workforce and affordable housing. There were some questions around our analysis relating to some of the affordable housing provisions. We'll be following up on that. And I have some other information about it later in the slides that we can go through as well. And then estimate needs based on accessibility. So we're going to go through how we took that data and applied it in 1 second. So now we're going to go through the growth target and population projection. And the question is, do the alternatives adequately address the range of growth that should be considered to satisfy local housing? And even if we don't end up going with a larger projection or growth target than what we were given, there still is, I think, a good benefit of going through the alternatives analysis and kind of answering some of those questions around whether we can support infrastructure, schools, parks, those types of things. Okay, so the first one is the affordable housing allocation. We just imported that over to the right. The second one deals with the internal affordability gap. Again, looking at household incomes and housing supply, which is a little bit different than looking at who is cost burdened. And that was the subject of some of the questions we received. When we did the analysis originally, we had combined it with the workforce, which is 2B. And for that, we took out 14% of those. And in that analysis, we inadvertently took 14% out of 2A as well. So that's why that one is at 43% right now and not 50. If we did bump it up to 50%, it would be another 31 units. Yes. Okay. So let's take 2B. So that's the workforce living outside of Sammamish. So these are the categories of worker incomes that we looked at of workers that don't live in Sammamish, right? So it's 86% of the workers. And so, this is the number of units we would need to provide if every single person who worked in Sammamish lived here, right? But clearly that's not realistic. So again, the policy question for the community is how much opportunity do we want to provide for folks to work and live in Sammamish? And again, this gets into the data, but it also gets into personal preferences, other needs of members in the households, affordability, commuting, all sorts of things. So what we have done, just to kind of keep it simple and again, focus on the opportunities, we said, well, what if we provided opportunities for 50%? And that's what the number is porting over to the right-hand side. But again, we could set that at 10%, we could set it at 100%, you know, again, it's input that we could change. So 2A, we intended to do the same thing, but again, because we had lumped it in the table on the previous slide, we had inadvertently taken out 14% of the category under 2A. So that's why only 43% of that number is being put into the combined need. If we bump that back up to 50%, it would add 31 units. So not, you know, a real substantive change, but we did want to highlight that. And then 2C looks at the household unit size mismatch. And again, we find a deficit of 1,500 studio and one bedrooms, assuming again, those smaller household sizes wanted smaller units. And then two bedroom deficit of 4,318. So again, it gets back to the policy question, how much opportunity do we want to provide for smaller units? I think the middle housing bill certainly will provide some opportunity, but as will the increased capacity in the centers, because those are typically going to be mid-rise construction, which tend to have smaller units. I think certainly we could set a goal or have some guidance in the development regulations that could specify these ratios so that, you know, we had some, say, family-sized units and some diversity of housing types. That would be another policy choice. So that is to say that the percentages of the amounts that have been put over into the combined need, you know, those are levers that we can shift up or down. So when you put all that together, again, the 0 to 30 for the permanent supported and non-permanent supported stays the same. That's the $14.99. I think regardless of how we settle on doing the analysis in the 0 to 30%, it's not going to exceed that amount. So we're planning for more affordable housing than the data indicates we would need based on Sammamish data. 50% AMI, I believe that one is also stayed the same, or maybe was bumped up a little bit. The biggest change was in the 50 to 80, was bumped up significantly for the workforce housing. And then the 80 to 120 plus is also all local need because we were not allocated any units in those ranges. So again, it gets back to, you know, do we follow the letter of the guidance of the 2100, or, you know, is this starting to look maybe a little bit more like what might actually play out? I think is a good question for us to consider.
Is there going to be a question slide? Because I think you said after each section. I mean, unless it's on that slide, because I'm like, there's going to be probably a question on each slide.
However you would like to do it. I'm open, but yes, there will be a question slide at the end of each section.
Okay, so are you guys good to wait for that, or do you need to? Cool.
I've got a lot of math questions.
Okay.
Yeah, just get to the question slide,
Oh, okay.
and then we'll come back.
Okay, so just again, so this is where we get into the population projection. So we have to convert the units to people. If we use the generic household size, I think of roughly 3 something for Sammamish, which is, you know, obviously what it is today, but that's based on larger household sizes. So we've used a dynamic household size that's tailored to the types of units that we think will be developed. So in some cases, you know, it's a lower number for the units that are going to be built in the center. Again, that's average, so we do expect there'll be some deviation from that. 2.5 for some of the units we think will be maybe middle housing or ADU projects, and then the larger one for the upper AMI income bands. So that ends up with a population projection of 13,220 additional residents at the 5544 over the 20-year period. So you put that into just basic linear progression, right? We don't, again, envision that it's going to be the exact same amount of growth every year, but if you span it out over 20 years, that's what it looks like. And then we did include where under those assumptions we would hit the 75,000 population threshold, which would put us over the threshold for the new requirements under HB 1110. This represents growth annually of a little less than 1% for reference. And then this shows the population based on local needs. and the growth target, and then the baseline alternatives down below based on just the 2,100 units. And based on that, we don't even hit the 75,000 in the planning period. So put that all together, and these are the total allocations. And then just a reminder, there's also some emergency housing that's not included in the target specifically. And then over on the left-hand side, you can see the incomes needed to have affordable housing in those ranges. Okay, so this just looks at the housing capacity within the different buckets of areas we've looked at in the city. So again, this is capacity. So this is, I guess, opportunity to describe it another way. So in the increased capacity in the centers, we'd have a total capacity of close to 4,000 units. And that would include the town center. In the, what we're calling still the bonus parcels, publicly owned properties, religious institutions and the like, 1,800. We've made some modifications to that based on our workshop with city staff. Again, these all account for critical areas and market factor and other things. So wanted to make sure we highlighted that. And then middle housing, we think there's a modest affordability component that we could include in that based on the HB 1110 guidance. Capacity of 6,200 roughly, 5,000 in market rate units and 1,250 in income restricted. And then this diagram kind of shows how the capacity and the two alternatives relate to each other. So the capacity is up there around 12,000, again, starting from around 2,000 to 3,000. The action alternative that we brought forth tonight would be 5,544. The base alternative would be 2,100. And if we did move forward with two alternatives and there was a range, then the preferred alternative would have to be within that range. Again, the guidance from King County says it should be the bottom of that range, but I think there's perhaps some opportunity for discussion of that. But as long as we don't go outside of that range, we would be in compliance. And then we haven't talked a lot about jobs because there's been so much emphasis on housing, but we do have a jobs target of 728. Total capacity, assuming a low floor to area ratio in the centers, more typical of what you see today, would give us about 1,150 jobs capacity. The high capacity, if we upped our assumptions on floor to area ratio, would be about 1,662 jobs. But I think, you know, based on the guidance from King County, and this is something we'll explore a bit, obviously in the economic development element, but I would suggest, you know, planning for the 728 at this point until, you know, we go through the economic development element, and if we have a really change in strategic direction around economic development and job growth, then I think we could revisit this. Also, as David brought up, which I think is a great point, you know, there's also an opportunity, I think, to capture work and home jobs and you know, how those are factored in a multitude of ways. Okay, we're at the question side. So looking for input on the alternatives and, you know, whether they address the range of growth that should be considered. You know, we've had some comments, it's not high enough. Other comments, it's too high. So, you know, seems to be comments that run the range of options, and we're just interested in your feedback. And, you know, just to say that I think what we've been trying to do is come up with what we think is the most realistic beyond the 2,100 units, you know, sort of a right sizing scenario. Right?
Great,
Okay.
thank you. Councilmember O'Farrell?
Yeah, I've kind of got a very elementary question because that's kind of where I'm at. So the baseline alternative, which was the second option you had on the previous slide, is the 2,100 units and pretty much keeping everything as it is and keeping our growth in the town centre area. If we did that, that appears to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that appears to me then we have no hope of reaching that affordable housing allocation of 2,100 units, right? Or am I wrong in that interpretation? That the only way really, because when we're looking at the alternative, is that if we increase our market rate housing, then we have some hope of accommodating this 2,100 allocation of affordable housing. Am I right? Am
I would
wrong?
say yes, except that even if you assume the 2,100, you can still do your regulations the same way as you would for alternative 2. Or the action alternative, which is confusing. You just wouldn't base your capital facilities or your parks plan on getting those market rate units. You would base it on the 2,100 units, but you could still create the same capacity within the centers for that to happen. It just, again, this is the odd tension. It wouldn't play out the way that you had structured your plan.
So if we went with the baseline alternative of the 2,100 units and only looking for that growth in mixed-use centres, existing residential areas, town centre, we can get those 2,100 units. And I wish the two numbers were not the same, because I find that very confusing.
Yeah.
At least maybe if one was 21 and the other was 22, that would help me keep these things straight in my head. But so are you saying that if we went with the baseline alternative, that we could still get the 2,100 affordable units in there also?
You
And
could.
is that
You could. And the reason,
4,200 units, or is that not?
well, I have a
that's where
slide
I
later that
keep fighting
shows
with that.
our strategy for how you do that in the centers, which requires a market-based approach, right? Because the landowners of the shopping centers are not going to give land away for affordable housing. But the bonus parcels, the public parcels, religious institutions, those do not require offsets. Some of the middle housing options are already embedded in the density we have to do for HB 1110, so that's okay. But HB 1110 is a great example, right? Like, you have to go in and change your entire single-family zoning districts, but you don't have to plan for all the capacity that you're creating, if that makes sense. So you could essentially do the same regulatory approach of either alternative. It's just that you're being a little bit naive in terms of what you're actually basing your plan on, which is kind of the hallmark of the Growth Management Act. And that's where, as a professional planner, I struggle, because yes, we want to meet the mandate, but at the same time, I think we have a responsibility to be accurate in what we think is likely to play out. So hopefully that answered your question, but I think we can get there. It's just we wouldn't embed those market rate units into some of our other elements.
I have a very hard time visualizing this, and as I'm sure lots of people do, seeing how this is all going to play out. So thank you for answering my question, but I think I need lots more time with this.
Yeah,
Can
I
I-
totally understand.
Can I add one thing to that? So one thing to keep in mind is the city's 2019 zoned capacity as studied under the Urban Growth Capacity Study, plus the balance of units that remain under the 2,000 unit FEIS cap in the town center is 3,158 units. So that's the number that is the current zoned capacity that we're working off of. Now keep in mind, that's 2019. So but that compares to the 2,100, which is when the growth target was, which is the same data set that the growth target was set off of. So there is still some freeboard above the 2,100 unit growth target for additional units in capacity. However, as has been pointed out here, it really depends on the blend of strategies that you take on as to what your preferred approach is. If you're not wanting to pursue bonus units or zoning or inclusionary zoning or TDRs that incentivize it, as Jeff said, and you want to rely on the bonus parcels, which is their religious-owned, city-owned properties, then you could achieve it. But if you're not relying on those and you are relying on the market to build it, well, then you do need to include that incentive for the market to want to do it, because otherwise the market won't do it.
Yeah.
Councilmember Stewart?
Thank you. Can you back up to the summary of local needs slide, please? So we don't have any workforce. We don't have any needs in the workforce housing in the 0 to 30 AMI range?
Yeah, and again, this is partially a data issue, and if you recall from the housing needs assessment recently done, they also had worker data, and it was the same data. Because of the way that the categories are sort of aggregated, when you look at the median incomes in different categories, none of them fall into the 0 to 30%. For example, retail trade displays at 100,000.
So the grocery store workers aren't making 100,000,
Yeah.
right? They're making like probably roughly, I mean, I think they were advertising at 22 an hour, so that's 45,000 a year. Right?
And we did look at a list of jobs in the city, and we pulled job descriptions from the water and sewer district, from other jobs that we knew of in the city, and the reality is real life experience does not match the data set that we are working off of. So we don't know why that's not, we didn't pull the data set together. We were looking at the data set, but we agree.
Can you share the data that you
Yeah.
used? I just really want to see the data, because
Yeah.
I know people who work in the city who make between 0 and 30% AMI. So there are people who don't live here but work here
Yeah.
that fall into that category. And so if we have bad data, let's figure out how we fix that, because again, I don't want to plan to fail. I'd rather us
Yeah.
have something more realistic.
Totally agree. We will absolutely follow up on that. And I think another kind of synonymous example is what we were talking about earlier. When we're looking at the data, say of 0 to 30%, there's like 600 and something that are homeowners pre-2019. So I think there's also a case where it show up as low income but may have higher wealth, right? Because how do you become a homeowner in Sammamish during that time period and that income level? It seems like it would be impossible. And then there is also guidance from Department of Commerce that sort of advises communities to not really focus on ownership housing as much. And part of, again, not to say don't focus on it in terms of your zoning plan and opportunities, but that the analysis to determine cost burden is challenging, because there has to be assumptions around down payments and so on and so forth. But also existing homeowners, it implies some measure of housing stability was the guidance from them.
So again, if I'm reading this chart correctly, the squiggly lines actually mean a deficit.
Yep.
So that's a negative.
Yep.
Because we used a positive, okay. So we need 498 units in the 30 to 50 according to this. And you'll send us the data and the math on
Yes.
how you got to all this, okay.
Yep.
All right, so these are the local needs.
Yep.
And then if we go to the next slide, keep going, there we go. So is that 2B, were those numbers, I'm trying to make these numbers match.
Yeah, so 2A and 2B are the second line. Sorry, let me just go back up. This is 2A and 2B. This is where we collapsed them because the data produces in the same categories. So we thought it was easier to show it together.
Okay.
So that's 2A and B combined, and then.
Okay, so wait, so 2A and 2B, all right, I'm going to have to go
Yep.
back and add those up. But so you're saying there's 3282. All right, go ahead. Sorry, this is just really hard to follow.
Yeah, no, I totally believe
Well,
it.
especially because they're not on the same thing and we don't see the math. So go to the next, the 2A. I'm trying to understand the 2A and the 2B, and you don't show the math. So we're saying we address 43% of the internal affordability gap. Why would we only address 43% of the internal affordability gap? Wouldn't we want to address 100% of our internal affordability gap?
We could. Again, that's completely a policy question. Again, in most categories, we were already planning for more than the local need was. So that's.
Well, but I'm trying to understand
Yeah.
what this number represents. I'm just trying to understand it. Like, if we have an affordability gap, and you're saying that internally we only have an affordability gap in the 100 to 120% range. If we know we have an affordability gap, why would we only internally? This isn't even workforce, right? This is just internal.
Mm-hmm.
Where did we come up with we just ran, like 43% just seems like an oddly specific random
Yeah,
number.
again, the intention was to have it at 50%. That was the.
Then why did we pick 43?
We didn't. We made a math error because in order to do the workforce housing allocation, we have to take out the workers that already live in Sammamish, which is 14%. And since we had aggregated them on the previous slide, we also took 14% out of 2A inadvertently,
would be
which brought it down to
57.
43%. If we brought that up to 50, that would just add 31 units to the combined housing need.
Okay, that was, again, a lot of math. If there's a way you can kind of send us some of this, because that just got really confusing.
Yeah, we'll repackage
So was it the
that up.
half of the 14? Is that the 7 that's out of, like that? You threw a lot of numbers around and it still doesn't really make any sense. So then if I look at this, you're saying we have the regional requirements that we were given.
Yep.
We have an internal gap, and we only have a gap at 100 to 120, which I'm still not convinced of, because according to the data we talked about, there are 850 households that make between 0 and 30% AMI, but we don't have 850 units in the city that are affordable between
Yeah.
0 and 30% AMI.
Right, and 660 of those are labeled as cost burdens, but are homeowners.
Well, you can still be cost burden and be a homeowner.
Or you could have wealth and have low income.
Well, you could, and it's fine if you guys have a list of assumptions, but I think we need to see the math and
sure.
what those assumptions are. Because I don't think it's safe to assume that 100% of the homeowners who are appearing as cost burdened are not. It's fair to say that maybe not all of them are, but I don't think it's fair to say that 100% of the people who own a home are not cost burdened here.
Yeah, that's not what we're suggesting. I'm just saying that the homeownership piece is a little bit different, sorry. than
Sure,
the rental.
totally agree. And I think there should be a set of assumptions that said, we shouldn't assume that everyone who owns a home is cost burdened.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that there are many people who own homes
Yeah.
who are in fact cost burdened.
In the 0 to 30%, I think it was 215 households fell in that category, and there were 219 units. And
Wait, where did the 215 come? 215 people?
in the 0 to 30% AMI income category that are renters.
Okay, that are
Yep,
renters,
Yep.
okay.
And the number of units in that category, again, many of them were identified as having problems, which includes like, a non-working kitchen or something like that, was 219 units. So that's where the fairly close alignment came in
But
terms
that's
of
just for the
previous chart.
renters, because you assume that 100% of the homeowners were not cost burdened.
We didn't assume that, we just had a chart, we had just broken the charts up by housing and renting. So in the renting chart, that's the number.
But you're not showing any need internally for houses in the 0 to 30% range? Or are you saying that the
We already have 1,499 we're planning for, so we're overshooting it by a lot.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's the part that's missing, sorry. That was the math that I was
Yes.
looking for.
Yes. And that's where these things are overlapping, right? Like some of that regional need that we're accommodating of affordable housing could meet internal needs. So where we were planning for more than the local need, which in this case, we're confident we're doing by quite a bit. And we will follow up with more specifics to answer some of your questions, but
Okay.
that is the answer.
Well,
That's part of
that
it.
helps
Yeah.
a lot. Wow, that just, okay.
Okay.
So I think what would help is to kind of show, here are our total internal needs. Here are the total workforce needs. And then here's, what the regional, what our mandate is, and then here's the difference, right? And we're going to add those differences on. I
Yes.
think that would help so that we can see, not that they don't exist. And part of the reason I think we need to do that is because we do need to show the community that we aren't just building these homes because we've been mandated to regionally. We're building these units because there are people who live here today or work here today who need them. And I think that's a really important point for people to understand. This isn't some people that we're trying to attract to our city. These are people who are here. So that's really helpful.
Okay,
Thanks.
no
And
problem.
then the 30% of one-bedroom studio deficit, I don't see those added in. Or is it's 1,500 and then you multiply that by 35?
They're in the 1950.
1950.
Yeah. And again, that's again a policy question. I mean, if,
Hold on, how are they, so you got to back up again. How are they in the 1950?
because 35% of 15 is included in that number, along with the 50% of the 28, 48.
And 35% of 43?
35% of 15, 26.
Okay, so you got to show us all this math, because this just doesn't add up when you just spew the numbers at us, sorry.
Right.
Because there's two sets, and there's like 5,800 here in the 1 and 2 bedroom, right?
Yeah, we only took 35% of the one-bedroom studios. We didn't touch the two bedrooms.
Because,
Well, because I think they would be, well, one, it would increase the number significantly and would likely be in the higher affordability, ranges. But again, it's a policy question if we want to pursue it. I guess the other piece of it is that I think a number of the units in the other categories would likely fall into those categories as well. So there's some overlap, right? So if you have, say, market rate mid-rise housing in the centers as part of an affordable housing project, those are likely to be 1 and 2 bedroom units. So we're accounting for it somewhat already. And so again, the 35% was just additional opportunity that we could create.
so I love all the information you're sharing with us. I
Yeah.
think we really need to see all the assumptions that are in your head on paper so that we can figure out how the 55-44 pencils out.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're going to come back with a whole written report that's going to have all this in here, but we didn't want to do that until we had some direction and some discussion with the council.
But I don't feel like I can give you direction until I know what the needs are, right? Because you kind of want us to say, do you agree with these numbers? And I'm like, I don't think I know what these numbers are. And what percentage we want to do of something that I don't know what that something
Yeah.
is hard to say.
There's two questions here, right? The first is, do you understand generally the concept of if we are going to incentivize these units, that we need to do so with a blend of unit types? We can turn the dials on each one to get it to where we want it to be, and it ultimately ends up with a total that is what our new capacity needs to be, right? And it's shown here as 55-44. If you were to change the percentages on these, change the unit numbers on these, it might go down or up. But we cannot do less than what our affordable housing allocation requires,
Right.
right?
And to go back to Councilmember O'Farrell's question, is there a way to build 2,100 affordable units in the city without building any market rate units? Without having the incentives, like just through HB 1110 and religious organizations?
Not unless you had a very proactive organization out there doing it, like
Right.
the city purchasing land
Okay.
or whatever, but,
Okay.
not under a market-based system, absolutely not.
Great. I think that's an important point to understand, that the only way we're going to get to 2,100 affordable units is if we have some additional market rate units out there. And then the question is, and this is, I think, what I'm still confused about, is last time we talked, David, you said you guys were working on a ratio, right? That you were going to come up with what you thought was a reasonable ratio. If I look at this number, if I look at 55-44, you're telling me it's just over a 2-to-1 ratio. For every 2 market rates we build, we get an affordable. And I, no, but according to this number, is that realistic? Has anybody ever done that before?
Well, I'm going to, no one has done this before. I can say
Okay.
that.
Has
So
anyone come close to that?
Well, I think, there are cities that have inclusionary zoning programs, but there are typically done at a much higher or a lower ratio of affordable to market.
Right. So
Right.
what is the best ratio we've ever seen work in the history of the world?
Yeah. But I think when I get to that slide, I'll be able to explain it to you, because one of the key pieces of this is where you're starting from. So, right? So if your city now already allows very dense development, it's harder to put in an inclusionary zoning program. But if your densities are relatively low, as is in the case of Sammamish, that gives you much more opportunity to do it. So I'm going to explain that when we go through. So I think we have a strategy that will work a little bit different than your typical inclusionary zoning program, but offers a great economic incentive. And, so anyways, I'm looking forward to sharing that in a couple slides.
Okay, and where does HB 1110 factor in? When you did the HB 1110 analysis, did we do, I don't know that HB 1110 is going to have any impact on us because of the HOAs, right? So there are going to be a few pockets, but is it really going to produce much of anything in the city?
Well, I think, again, from my experience working in other cities, I think in general, middle housing tends to happen relatively slowly just because they're smaller projects, right? They tend to be infill projects. A lot of, properties in the city are still developed, and, even though you could add more units, it's not likely that people are going to tear down,
Right.
good single family. So I don't think it's going to be a high rate of development. I do think there's some opportunity to include some affordability levels in there. But, I wouldn't expect, it to be a real rapid rate of development.
Okay, 2 more questions, I promise. One, the 2,100 that we're required to build for affordable, those do not have to be near transit, correct? It's only if we were to go above that, right? Because the 2,100 mandate is just what our growth is, and that's
Well,
just
they
an
have to be in
assumption.
the res.
So according to the Commerce guidance, the only archetype that they identify as acceptable for affordable house, or for the range of 0 to 30% is mid-rise. And their guidance also talks about access to things like transit, walkability. So I would argue that the 0 to 30%, and most of these need to be built near services and transit.
But not the, sorry, I should have been more clear, not the high-capacity transit. It's if we were to go above and beyond is where we need the high-capacity transit. Fair enough. And then on the land use strategy housing type, which is here, no, wait, there's a different one. There was one that showed restricted units. It was like a bar graph. There. How did we get so many income restricted units? What are the assumptions that show the capacity, like in the bonus parcels?
Yeah, so in the centers, we're looking at a 3-to-1 ratio, or, sorry, a 1 to 2.
2 to 1.
Yeah, 2 to
right?
1. Yep, and so that's what
And
that's
then in
based
the
on.
bonus ones, it's most of them.
Yeah,
And then
because
in the
there's a
middle
little.
housing,
Yeah, so
it's-
the bonus one, oftentimes the bonus parcels are in zones that are already residentially zoned. So
Okay.
there's a basic, market rate capacity there, and then we've increased that for just affordable housing units. So that's one where you can increase capacity, but only for affordable housing, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd love to, again, see the assumptions behind this, because
Yep.
this is very promising looking, but I want to understand how real this is, right?
Yeah. And then
Because
I think
again, if we only need 2,100 affordable, if we kind of ratcheted that down, that would, although
yeah.
that still says we would need 4,000 market rate to get to roughly 2,100 in that affordable range, which is still bigger than the 5544, so.
Yes. Okay.
Cool, thanks.
So from what I understand, we have more slides still, correct?
I don't even think we're halfway through.
Okay. No, I know. I know we have questions. I'm just saying we're not halfway through the
No, but it'll
PowerPoint
go a
either.
lot faster, I think, after we
Awesome.
get through these
All right.
ones.
Deputy Mayor Lamb.
My question is on planning for the 75,000.
Yeah.
So if we plan for the 75,000, we're obviously going to increase density, as David mentioned, throughout the city. So instead of allowing for 2 units per lot, we are going to allow for 4. But if you take away all the homes that are in HOAs and the critical areas, how much would that actually change the landscape if we were to plan for the 75,000?
Yeah, good question. So the provisions of HB 1110 go from 2, under the population thresholds, go from 2, which we're in now, to 4 units per lot. But where there is still a decision point is what happens when a larger property is developed and subdivided. You still have a say in how big or small those lots are that would be created out of that. So I think in terms of say there was a greenfield development on a 2-acre parcel and it was subdivided, I think the regulations under both options would be relatively similar there. Where there would be a big difference is every existing lot in the city that wasn't restricted by an HOA could now put 4 units in instead of 2 units. So it seems like in many cases that would be pretty, challenging. So, is it likely to rapidly increase the rate of development? I'd say probably not. The risk of, I guess the challenge in not doing it is then eventually you'll have to go and kind of redo your code at some point under a different set of assumptions. So there is that piece. But, based on the population projections, that could theoretically not happen for another 20 years. So I think there's pros and cons. If this was not also included with so much other change, it might not seem like a big deal, but, since we're already making significant changes in the centers and the BOSINS parcels and even the basic 1110 compliance, it's already quite a bit of change. So I guess I'm just a little cautious of how much we want to take on, but I think it could work either way, I guess, is kind of my professional opinion.
Okay, so it just sounds like kind of a wash.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Howe?
Thank you for letting us grill you. But this really helps us wrestle this to the ground. So I appreciate your willingness to engage on this. It's very helpful for us. There's a couple of questions for me on the job growth, the 728-ish number. Isn't that also dependent on the commercial space and how that's developed? So does anybody remember what job growth was determined from the, like, say, 80,000 square feet of commercial space? Or
There is a number assigned to that.
There is.
That was associated with the urban growth capacity study. It's a number that King County gave us.
Okay.
I don't know what that number is offhand. That was
Yeah.
back in 2019. We could definitely pull that out and dust it off and send it over if you'd like to see that.
I'm just trying to figure out, where that additional growth is going to come from a little bit, and because I think that's very realistic. I think that's my best fast track to understanding where that job growth is going to happen. On the slide that talked about, I think it was the local summary,
Yeah, the local summary. This one.
There we go. So just so that I understand that one too, when I look at, well, it's also 2C. Am I assuming that on 2C, that the studio and one-bedroom units, that those are primarily rental? Did you kind of make that assumption? Because where I would love to understand is what's our percentage? What's our ratio of rental to home ownership?
Yeah.
And that's kind of just a general comment that I would have for our stats, just kind of in general, because we need the rentals. We need
Yeah,
the rental.
Yep, I can get you those numbers. It's something like 3,000 renters versus 15 or 16,000 homeowners. It's significant. So we didn't make an assumption, but knowing the condo laws and just how development works, it's likely they would be rentals. But, that's not something we can regulate or
Right,
we
right.
necessarily assume. But yeah, I would assume it's more likely they would be rentals.
Yeah, because it's actually something, rentals is something that I would encourage. Because it's the fastest way to get a variety of different of new residents here and someplace where they want to stay, potentially, and discover. And it's also the place where when you downsize, you need to stay someplace. And so you're not ready to buy the next thing. So a rental is really handy to have. So that works for me. And again, just thank you for diving in.
No problem, anytime. Any other questions?
Councilmember Trine?
Yeah, so can you go to the question sheet for us? Because you had questions that you were asking us, right?
I did.
Okay, so confirm the land use alternates for comprehensive plan update. So is that like the 6 of the 9?
Well, the 6 of the 9 is coming up. What we're really asking now is, we're basically now having a conversation around 2,100 units up to, say, 55, a little higher than 55. Is that within the ballpark of, what you think is reasonable to consider for the city? I mean, there's been lots of public input about incorporating local housing needs. There's a housing needs assessment, a housing diversification toolkit. Are either of these trending in the right direction?
Okay,
just kind of
so-
looking for thoughts,
Yeah, so initially I would say that, well, Initially, what I'd say is the council made a huge mistake when we raised our growth target to 2,100. We wouldn't be sitting in this situation today. But since we sit in that situation today, it probably should be sticking right around that 2,100. That would be my first input for you.
Okay.
If you want to then incentivize to reach the affordable housing units, that would need to be to meet some standard, then let's look at incentivizing and see what the market will bear. And then, but I really think, based on the 6 that I have here for you for later on, I think we can meet it in different ways. As far as middle housing, yeah, good. Let's thread the needle and figure out how we can do that with the fact that we have the limitations on HOAs. As far as the 7,000 or 75,000, I've analyzed this now, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 different ways, trying to figure out, okay, based on the census report, based on different time periods within the city over 4 years, what's the average? How do I account for the fact that there was 31,000 new additional population growth when Klahani entered in 2016? So how do we put in that? How do I come up with a number that actually statistically would make actual sense for the kind of population growth that we would have in the city over the next 20 years? There's no real answer that I can come up with. So I'm going to just say a range, right? So it seems to me that there's a range anywhere from about 750 a year to 1,050 a year. Could it go as much as 2,000? I doubt it. But there is some data that would show that, yeah, I could show you data that would show that there's a growth on average of 2,000 a year. I don't think that's possible. But there's another number that's pretty interesting if you want to take this into consideration. It's from the U.S. Census, but they're showing that we have a decline in our population from 2020 to 2022 of 2.4%. That's an estimate.
I didn't notice that.
But that is definitely, I mean, it's on the website. I just looked at it again today. And so again, how do I plan? How do the professionals plan for growth when there's an estimate that we're actually going to decline in our population?
Yeah.
And then there's all kinds of little nuances, especially after teaching sociology for the last 3 weeks. I'm looking at it going, holy, so what about my birth rates? What about my death rates? What about immigration? What about people who are leaving? How about people who are moving in? What's my housing stock look like currently? So all those questions I take into account. So really, I'm just going to throw, is it 1,000? All right. I'll get, if you want to plan for 1,000, I could support that, right? So 20 years, 20,000, that puts it at 85. So would I be willing to look at the 75,000 that we could possibly reach that? Yeah, but it then would tell me is I also am smart enough to understand that this plan gets relooked at in 10 years. So I have no desire then to look at something that if in 10 years we're going to just turn around and do something completely, we're going to really look at some actual numbers, not just planning numbers, and then pushing it forward. So does that make sense to you as far as how I feel about this 75,000? I think there's a possibility we could go over it.
Yeah.
But if we provide the kind of housing that I think is in the next section, we're not going to hit the 75,000.
Yeah, I mean, no, that totally makes sense. And, you know, when we go and do the next periodic update and the county does the buildable lands, they're going to have the benefit of having all of the new assumptions and things. Like none of this was, I mean, I don't want to say it's, well, it is somewhat outdated. I mean, we had to update the assumptions. So I think, you know, that will have some benefit to the cities at that time, along with some lessons learned. So, no, I appreciate those comments.
Yeah, so, and then on your last one there, where you're talking about that input on the draft, future land use map,
Yeah, we haven't showed that one yet. That's a question for later, but yeah, we will get to that.
all right, then I'll hold my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so now we're going to get into the affordable housing concept. So again, Basically, part of our strategy is to upzone the centers, which can allow for affordable housing to be developed in a form of inclusionary zoning, okay? So the first question is we want to understand how the center strategy more broadly supports the vision for people, planet, and prosperity. For example, what does more density in the centers bring for transportation opportunities, reducing greenhouse gases, fiscal sustainability in terms of land production per acre, some of the stuff that Mary Wichter sent from some great folks that do that kind of analysis. So give some thought to that. And then how does the center's strategy relate to community building, climate planning, and fiscal sustainability? Similar to what I said, I think there are some interesting tie-ins there. Okay, so hopefully some of you appreciate Legos, but we use this for just demonstration purposes. And this was one of the exercises we did with city staff a couple of weeks ago. So again, inclusionary zoning programs, legally are basically, the way that you can do that is you can upzone your property, and that upzone is basically a new benefit to the property owner. And in exchange for increasing the density, you can then require a portion of the development to be affordable, right? And so if you were a city that said, in our town center, we have unlimited density, you could never put an affordable inclusionary program in because you can't downzone it and then re-upzone it. So a lot of it is what you're starting from. And then fortunately for Sammamish, your densities are relatively low and there is really no housing in the centers other than the town center. So the good news is you're starting from a really good spot there. The other thing is that typical inclusionary zoning programs work with higher spectrum of affordability, so typically not 50% and below, which is most of our allocation, right? And the reason is that the market rate developer is taking a loss on those affordable units in exchange for building more market rate units to offset that. And oftentimes cities get those ratios wrong and they don't work. So you'll either have a developer paying into a fund to get out of it, which is something we can include, particularly for smaller projects, or they don't get built, so on and so forth. So right now, in the centers, the density is 18 units an acre, okay? This is the diagram over on the left right here. And we're estimating that under the existing shopping centers, we're just assuming for the purpose of conversation that there's, say, an FAR of 50%. That means that the strip malls and commercial spaces, the floor area of those is half the size of the lot, right? It's relatively low density, they're one story, so on and so forth. So that's got a certain economic value associated with that for the owner. Under current zoning, they're allowed to do 18 units an acre. So this theoretical parcel that we're looking at under each of these scenarios is 10 acres. So let's say we had a 10-acre shopping center in one of our centers and they wanted to redevelop under the program or they wanted to develop. So right now they could go and they could add 180 units to the top of their one-story building, let's say, and add some parking. So that's under existing. Under the proposed program, what we're looking to do is to match up commercial property owner developers with affordable housing providers through a community partnership to develop more market rate units in addition for them providing either air rights or space. I mean, right now they could provide air rights. There's nothing happening above the first story of those buildings. And in exchange for doing that on a 10-acre parcel, we would give them the rights to build 487 more market rate units. Those 487 market rate units, assuming a typical value of a multifamily unit, would represent an investment value of approximately $200 million, just that one parcel. And in exchange for getting that opportunity to develop 487 units of housing, they have to provide air rights integrated into their project, provide a portion of their land area, however they want to do it, to an affordable housing provider who will then build those units independent, somewhat independent of the private developer. So the private developer is giving land or air rights to provide the project, but they don't have to take a loss on the development of the market rate units in the same method that you would under a typical inclusionary zoning program, where let's say I'm the developer and I develop 10 units, one of them's affordable, I have to sell that one at a loss, but I got to build 2 more and I offset it. In this scenario, yes, you are providing land but that land is only more valuable because we've upzoned it. So basically, this is a sort of a different approach to inclusionary zoning, where you're, again, upzoning, creating significant market value in exchange for that partnership with an affordable housing provider, which for affordable housing, you know, the biggest obstacle is finding the land to do it. So the question that we would propose to developers and property owners as part of the due diligence and engagement process for the alternatives and for the plan is, you know, whether that is something that would seem attractive to them. And so that's the basic kind of component of it. If you would develop that 10-acre parcel at 100 units an acre, you'd end up with 333 affordable units, 667 market rate units, and you could still have the ground floor as commercial space. So for smaller projects that were less than 10 acres that didn't have the economies of scale, you know, you could allow a fee in lieu of, which could then go and support a larger project like this. Maybe that money is used to support infrastructure or whatnot. We've talked with the schools potentially about partnering, looking at new locations for schools. They seem very interested in that. So this would be predicated on partnerships. This is not a type of inclusionary zoning that you know, is typical, but a typical approach isn't going to work. The numbers just simply don't work. If we had more land area to work with, sure, but the fact that we're constrained in terms of the land that we have to work with makes it difficult. And then on the, you know, again, on the bonus, what we're calling the bonus parcels, those don't need market rate offsets, so they're a little bit different, and we think those would be targeted towards the permanently supportive housing allocation and the 0 to 30. This would, you know, primarily, not that we would set this in stone, but be primarily maybe 30 and above for the affordable units. Questions?
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, so right now we require 10% of what gets built to be affordable, so we would be giving that up for,
I don't think in the centers we do. Just the
yeah, town center.
Yeah.
Yeah, not in the outlying centers.
Okay, but we could, I mean, I guess what's shocking to me is I thought you were going to propose that a third that gets constructed have to be affordable, and I was totally down with that. The just creating the land or the air rights and someone else still has to find the money to build them feels like a step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of money that doesn't exist to go get those built, as opposed to, I mean, they're not giving up anything, right? We're giving them
Well,
487 market rate units.
they theoretically are giving up land, but again.
But they're not, because they don't have it right now, right? So right now, they can build a,
There's land and there's value. They're not giving up a lot of value because we've just offset that by
well, they're not
significant
they
amounts.
have, right now, they can build 180. We're going to give them 487. I feel like we should be, if we're going to give them another 487 units, we should be getting a lot more than just, we'll save you a space.
Well, no, they would only get the 487 units if the 333 affordable units got built with it. They can't access the bonus units unless.
But
they
they're
have
not
the bonus.
paying to build them. You're saying someone else has to
No,
pay
but
to build them.
the trick is that the affordable housing provider, who is always looking for land, gets the land without having to pay anything for it,
Mm.
theoretically.
I have to think a whole lot more about that. Thanks.
So that's the concept, lots of vetting to go through, and other questions be happy to answer.
Councilmember Howe.
Actually, I think you might have just answered the question I was going to ask, because what I'd understood from the development side is that anytime we start to put restrictions on them, they start to balk. But if they do in fact have access to inexpensive or affordable land, that becomes the incentive. And I think it becomes something that, and this is for a later discussion, but as we look ahead, you know, putting other encumbrances on it that increase their cost of development, we have to really be careful with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not to say there couldn't be offsets or contributions on the city or other public agencies to help support development of the affordable units. It's just the biggest obstacle is land. And so this is a market rate solution to try to get access to land through increase of the value. But it also just shows the power that the city has to create incentives and drive, market behavior towards public goals, right? I mean, just this one 10-acre parcel through an upzoning, again, that's $200 million of investment, just those 487 units.
Thank you.
All good. All
Okay.
good.
So, again, I think you asked questions. I don't know if others have thoughts, but again, what does this increased potential density do for transit? For kind of public spaces, cultural events, walking and biking, fiscal sustainability, right? The economics of a development like this look very different than a single-family neighborhood on a per acre value basis. Anyways, and I think it is just, again, more illuminating to the power the city has. And I think, again, the city's in a really good position, probably better than a lot of other cities, because there hasn't been the amount of upzoning that's happened in the past. That's a real benefit that you want to think really wisely about before you make any big changes. Because once you do it, you can't go back.
Yep.
Any thoughts, or should I keep going?
Do you still have more slides?
Okay.
Well, I
I
think
thought
we
he
do
wanted
have-
to, I was going to answer his questions because I don't think we
I
all
mean, these are
answered
the same questions that were on the
But most of
first
us didn't
slide.
answer them.
Well,
did we?
one person answered. So are these going to be coming again at the very end? Because I would rather not keep ping-ponging.
Yeah, it was just, we wanted to introduce the questions you thought about it and then come back to it. No, we're not going to ask this question again. We're just going to,
So you want everyone to go through and answer all of these?
I don't necessarily want everyone to answer if you really want to. If you have thoughts, it's really more about, do you understand the connection between the land use plan and some of these other goals, which I think is really just important to highlight. If that's okay, we can move on. If you want to answer my question, I'd be happy to take it.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, that our target number is 2,100, and with the market offset, it is 5,544. But if we were to meet the target and all the local needs, that would be 15,749. I think there's a huge difference between 2,100 and 15,749. So I do believe that the number should be higher than 5,544.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I think we don't try to plan for the 75,000 right now, in part because I don't think that we have that many neighborhoods that aren't restricted by HOA, so I'm not sure how big of a difference it's going to make. And to your point, we have a lot of other changes to deal with, and we're probably not going to hit that for a while. So that would be my take on the 75,000 number. I definitely think we need to look at creative strategies in our centers. Not totally comfortable with what you presented, but I like the creativity of it and how that makes us think. I agree we have to figure out what the right ratio is and what we're going to actually try to plan for in terms of trying to get to 2,100 affordable units. So I understand there's a relationship there. I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to anything yet until we get some more of the math. Thanks.
Councilmember Howe?
Actually, I'm kind of interested in planning to the 7,500. So I differ on that one. 75,000. Sorry, there's a little difference. There's a zero, a couple of zeros there. And what I want, and I know you can't answer this, but we're not going to be the only place that's going to run into the homeowners association thing. I predict that there will be kits being sent out to different homeowners associations to teach you how to unseat and unlock zoning practices, potentially for your HOA. So again, this will take a lot of time, but I do think that that there will be a path forward to try to overturn where those homeowner associations are blocking us on 11110. So that is kind of where I think I differ, as I see a path forward.
Councilmember Napure?
Turn this on. So I really like the idea of the city centers and how can we, make them to be mixed use, because I think I've seen it in other cities, especially Woodinville, where we seem to go often. I think one of the reason why I'm more in preference of that is also because of the HOA restrictions and just trying to imagine if housing had to go in areas which is not HOA controlled, it can look very lopsided. So I'm a little curious about that and want to learn. I mean, the city is at 67,000 people right now. And I mean, this is for planning purposes. So my preference would be to plan for the 75,000 because I know that we're going to cross that very quickly. And I think given the jobs and the economic forecast, this area is very attractive to families, especially to come in with the schools. So I think that would be my preference.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I would also like to plan for the 75,000. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
I would have to agree with Councilmember Stewart about not exceeding the 75,000. I don't think we quite know what's going to happen. We did have a population decrease, but that was, you couldn't, as a response maybe to COVID, who knows what that decrease was. Maybe it's also decreased because people can't find the right housing that they need for their particular stage in life, who knows. But we're kind of heading into difficult times, and I don't know if we're going to see the kind of population increase in Sammamish that we've seen over the last 10 years, where we saw like a jump of 20,000 from 2014, and I just can't see that we're going to see those kinds of population increases with lots of people moving here from other parts of the world and other parts of the country due to various industries having an upswing. So I just don't see that happening. I think it's going to slow down greatly. So I would be in favor of keeping it under the 75,000.
So if we're going to split on that 75,000, I just assume you're going to give us both plans. Is that what? Maybe not.
Well, I mean, it does sound like there's a pretty good split. I mean, we could come back with a little more specifics around the implications of it. We have some graphics we're going to share that I think will help with that discussion, and we can dig in a little more and then hopefully come to a resolution on it. And, as I said, I think we can make it work either way. It's just kind of a local decision that we need to work through.
Yeah, no, I think that would be helpful. And I would say for the growth target, I think even a year ago, I wanted it to be higher. So I would love to see what that looked like. And then obviously we're very constrained. So Deputy Mayor Lamb.
I just wanted to make one last comment regarding the 75,000 is that, yeah, planning for 20 years is farther into the future, but at the same time, we all recognize the changes that's happening with climate, and we don't know, how much hotter it is going to be down in the lower portions of the country. And, California and Arizona, they could be out of water, and we don't know if there's going to be huge population migration happening at least in the next 15 years. So I don't know if that's even accounted for when we talk about population growth.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, theoretically, it's somewhat accounted for in the state's population projection that filters down to us, but not on the sort of micro city level. But that's a good point.
Please continue.
Thank you. Okay, middle housing type. So this gets into the HB 1110, and as I said earlier, the basic provision, which everyone's sort of focused on, is the number of units per lot. But really, I think the bigger implication is actually that we have to choose these 6 of 9 middle housing types that we want to allow, because I think inherent in that is, having regulations that make these things work, right? And so there's obviously going to need some reconsideration of density limits and so on and so forth. The other interesting thing about Sammamish is you don't have a minimum lot size. So if you put in a provision that says you can do 2 units on any lot and you don't have a minimum lot size, that creates a lot of flexibility. And so I think that's one thing that we're going to want to unpack in the code. And that's just one of a whole litany of things that we need to do in the code. So again, just want to impress upon you the importance of having sufficient time to draft code elements that will get adopted with the plan, because when people come and apply for permits, they're not going to look in the plan as much. They're going to go with what's in the code. We want to make sure that that is airtight, so for what it's worth. So again, our questions here, do you have input on the 6 of 9 middle housing types? I mean, I think it's fairly easy to just take the first 6 in the scale of density, and you're still at, you know, a very different place than you are now. So we could talk through that. I think there's also some opportunities to differentiate, like for example, maybe in the what's now the R1 zone, you allow a certain type. In the R4 through R8 zones as they exist today, maybe you allow a different type and different density. So there is some variation that we can consider there. So again, 2 units per lot, 4 units if at least 2 units are affordable. So that was some of the assumptions we used for the chart that showed assumptions of market and affordable units. We must enable 6 of the 9 types, which include duplexes, which are enabled in some cases, triplexes, fourplexes, fiveplexes, sixplexes, townhouses, stack flats, courtyard apartments, and cottage housing. Some of these of which we presented to you previously as options, and some of these which are allowed in other districts within the city. You can put in design review, but it needs to be administrative. You can't make it harder to do a middle housing project versus a single family home, but you can increase the standards for a single family home to bring them in alignment, if that makes sense. So you can't say, oh, we have design review if it's a triplex, or if it's a single family, just go get a building permit. They have to be aligned. And actually, even single family now is taking on more of a middle housing component, because under the ADU bill, you would be able to now do 2 units. So if you do a house in an ADU, you actually get more units, which is interesting, right? So there's lots of nuances in these bills, the way that they're related. Okay, so just quickly want to point out, we're mindful of the critical areas. We did do a quick calculation. We can eliminate 75%, or we can eliminate 25% of the lots if we want, but we're finding that critical areas are over the 25%. So, and, in a place that doesn't have transit, and I think, there's a lot of similarities between the single-family districts, it gets difficult to sort of parse out why you would do something in one place or another. So we would tend to keep it simple unless there is a fatal flaw or reason, a real strong reason not to allow it. We could let the critical areas do their work and limit development on those sites as well. So we're not recommending a big process to go through to eliminate that, since we're already over the 25% with the critical areas. Okay, so here are the different housing types. We include single family and detached ADUs, but just as a comparison. So you have the duplexes. We're showing a side-by-side duplex there, and photos of each of these. Triplexes, which can come in a variety of forms, either stacked configurations or more townhouse-like. Fourplex, showing a stacked building with 2 units per floor. Sixplex, same thing, but just with an extra story. Townhouses, which you're familiar with. Cottage clusters, which are great options for, say, larger parcels like in the R1 right now. Courtyard apartments, which are typically 2 to 3, story apartments with green space and courtyards, as it suggests, and then stack flats, which are the highest intensity. So we will end up with some sort of, regulatory framework that'll right-size the lots to the housing types, much like we did in phase 2 of the development regs. And I think we can build from that system and allow some progressive floor area increases to accommodate middle housing, while still ensuring that we have some limits on the bulk and scale of single-family homes relative to the lot sizes. And that was something that we started in phase 2. So now, anytime you develop a lot, there'll be sufficient room for ADUs, so they're future compatible. Whereas previously, some of the newer developments a few years ago, the lots had been shrunk so small that the only way you could do an ADU was if you carved it out of your existing footprint. So some things that we want to think about in terms of housing design and standards, things like site planning. Again, when you had a building permit, you could require, some thinking about future compatibility for, increases in units. So, could you add an ADU? Could you add another unit here or there? Massing and scale implications, so things like floor to area ratio limits, which we inputted in development regs phase 2. Parking design and placement, things like locations of alleys, access to driveways, use of on-street parking, co-located parking, impervious pavement, things like that. Integration of landscape design, landscaping, stormwater, obviously a big issue, but I wouldn't always assume that these more intense housing styles will have more coverage. There are single-family homes that encompass a high percentage of their lot, and then the overall lot and building coverage. So we can modify these standards during the development regs process. So we put together these little SketchUp models that kind of showcase these different housing styles. This is for what we would call an R12 district, so the density is 12 units an acre. And basically the lot sizes here are right sized to the number of units that are there. So you can see, for example, the 6-plex and the 4-plex, even though they're more intense, there is still a fair amount of green space that could be used for common open space, stormwater treatments. There could maybe even be an incentive where you allow a little bit smaller lot size in exchange for, say, like a community stormwater facility, a rain garden, or an open space that has broader benefits than just the development itself. And this is showing a front-loaded configuration. So one of the benefits of middle housing is it consolidates access. So instead of having 6 driveways for 6 units, you end up with 1. That allows quite a bit of on-street parking. The diagrams here are showing 1 parking stall per unit. Again, there are some limitations in some of the bills on parking, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't more parking, but we want to make sure that we're kind of right-sizing the approach to parking and using on-street parking, where it's available, since it's the most efficient from a space standpoint. We can provide some flexibility in site planning standards to protect significant trees, considering things like solar access, so on and so forth. So, I think these can be done in a way that can hopefully be compatible with existing neighborhoods. We just wanted to zoom in on a little bit on the 6-plex and 4-plex, and again, just show kind of their scale relative to their lot size. R12 is a relatively low density for these housing types, but certainly more dense than what you have today. So we just wanted to kind of show what that looked like. But R12 is, can really create some very nice neighborhoods, nice scale, a lot of ground-related units. This is the R12, same diagram, just with alley loaded. So what this does is it takes away all the curb cuts from the street, so it allows you a continuous block of on-street parking, which is great and very flexible. And then the alley, requires less driveways if you just have the parking kind of towards right off the alley access, creates a little bit more green space. It creates a really nice walkable environment, nice relationship of sort of streetscape to building face. And there are some great alley projects we looked at in Sammamish during phase 2, and so there, this has happened in Sammamish for sure. This is basically the same concept, except this is at an R18 density, so the density's bumped up. The housing typologies are exactly the same, it's just the lots are a little smaller. So you can see there's a little bit less green space, a little more kind of coverage of impervious surface in buildings, still opportunities to preserve trees. This is the front-loaded version, so there's still on-street parking, but not as much. This is the rear or alley-loaded version. Again, more on-street parking, access entirely from the alley, and it just creates a really nice neighborhood kind of feel. So with that said, does the council have input on those 6 of 9 middle housing types? And again, even if you just pick the first 6, that seems like a really good first step. Those are probably the most compatible. They're also the most likely to get developed. When we have done this exercise, we've been doing a lot of work with cities that have adopted housing action plans but haven't implemented them. So we've been helping them figure out, okay, well, you say you want to allow middle housing, where would you allow it and why, and what would it look like? And what we found in projects where, I know where I was going with this. In projects where we had an economics firm do a pro forma, that the most likely feasible housing types are going to be ownership and larger units like townhouses. Doesn't mean others won't or can't get developed, but those kind of tend to be what's most feasible. And I expect that would be the case in Sammamish.
Councilmember Howe? Oh, sorry. Councilmember Howe?
Thank you. I have a couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
When I attended a housing symposium recently, but it was, the houses were in Vancouver, so laneway houses. Do we have an equivalent? Does that sound familiar? It's like an ADU, but it looks like it's
It's an
different kind of
alley-loaded-
access.
It's like an alley-loaded
Yeah.
GADU.
And it looks like it's easy. It takes out restrictions, basically, to get it built.
Yeah.
So I looked
Yeah.
at that. It's very attractive. I also wanted to understand, we're not going to get too specific here, right? So if I said tiny home versus ADU, we don't have to get to that level, right?
Well, they're kind of the same thing. They're just
They
different
kind of are, but
terms.
they're
A
different.
tiny home could be an ADU, but it could also not be an ADU. Yeah.
And would we allow something like a manufactured home, which is designed as an ADU? Because different cities are creating ordinances now to prohibit them. I disagree with those because you hook them up just like you would a tiny home or an ADU. Goes into sewer, goes into,
Well, yeah, and some of the modular houses
They're
are
amazing.
fantastic.
They're amazing.
So I wouldn't recommend limiting those
Okay.
either. I mean, you could have standards for them, just
Sure.
like you would any other
Right.
building, but I wouldn't differentiate because I think some of them are fantastic.
okay, good. Okay, that's very helpful. And another thing that I saw was grow home. So grow home is row houses, but they're not really done yet. So what you do is you move into them, and as you acquire more wealth, you're able to finish them. There's a downside to them in that they may be uneven in terms of their quality as they're finished over time, but it does allow someone to move into a kind of unfinished unit where they, do the work and get it kind of patched together with plans. And so there's like 20 different types of homes that they mention in here in this booklet. Many of them are ones you've got in here, like the equivalent of Captain's Homes, which is the large home that has lots of like 18 rooms or something like that. The one thing you don't have in here is co-housing. It would be difficult to do, and they are problematic, but it is another type. I wondered if you were
Well,
looking at that.
co-housing is more of a organizational approach. So like
Challenge.
cottage housing could be co-housing, or some of the other ones could be.
Okay,
some of the
so
other types.
these
I
could
think
be-
You could allow it.
Could allow it.
It's typically
Okay.
not a zoning thing, but I mean, it's certainly something we could talk about. And we actually have a firm that we share office space with called Frolic that is focused on innovative financing methods for middle housing on single-family sites, and I could share some of that with you. I have not heard of the grow housing, so that's
Oh,
really
I got a
interesting.
whole thing on it.
Yep. So thanks for sharing that. We'll look into it.
Yeah, well, I'm very fond of anything that's alley loaded. That to me is just outstanding and gives a lot of flexibility, pulls the cars off the streets and into the back, and solves some of the parking issues because for the most part, all of the housing options will have parking challenges. So that will be a consistent thing across the board, I believe.
Yeah. Yep. And that street parking becomes really valuable. So,
And we don't have to limit ourselves to 6, right? We have a minimum of 6, but couldn't we just,
well, you could choose more. As
Smorgasbord
I
it?
said, you could allow some in some areas and some in other areas, right? It doesn't have to be uniform, right? So like, for example, you could say in what's now the R1, we're going to do R12 and these units, and in this location, we're going to do this density and these range, or you could, do any combination thereof.
of any of the ones that you had there? Okay, because I wouldn't want to be limit ourselves to 6 if we could do more 6 as land use maybe be appropriate for just kind of expanding it. I'm always going to kind of land on the side of minimizing the impact to the land and getting the most volume that we can out of it, because it just makes sense.
The only thing I would add against that is that you have to then design code for additional unit types. And the question is, do you want to do a few things really well, or do you want to do more things mostly well, but with a few more problems? And, from the production scale, I think our experience would be to try to focus on the ones we really want and to build up.
prioritize.
Prioritize those, yeah.
Councilman Brandon Pure.
Thank you. So I think my question was kind of related to that. So do we already have these 6 middle housing types already built in the city and existing somewhere or the other? So we have cottage houses,
Not in those zones, but I think there
not in
are.
the zones, but just generally,
Yeah.
we do have. So from a code perspective, we would still, I mean, if people wanted to build that,
Well, people could build it, but the bill requires it in the single-family zone, so in the 94% of the city where it's currently not allowed. And so, yes, we do allow them in the code, but we want to do a much more prescriptive approach to the code because we're dealing with a different type of environment in single-family neighborhoods. And some of those neighborhoods have access challenges and infrastructure challenges and things we heard a lot about during phase 2 of development regs. So I think we want to be more thoughtful about it, but yeah, there are some great examples of probably these types of housing in Sammamish that we can draw on and use as examples, but I think we want to up the bar a little bit in terms of how we approach it and add more graphics and things that help support good design.
and then would we like be very prescriptive? And so, for example, if there is a R1 zone, you know, somewhere on near 228, then they would be allowed to build only these kind of middle housing? Or, so can you help me understand, you know,
Yeah.
the prescriptive approach to, because, or can we dictate what gets built where? Or
Yeah,
is
you
it up
could-
to
you
the
could
developer?
You could potentially vary it by the type of street that it's on in terms of the standards. I mean, this again was something we talked about a lot in phase 2 about how development approaches arterial streets. So we had special standards for those. So if we have single-family zones that are on a busier street, we could maybe have some different guidelines on that. So it can be a little bit context sensitive, but I think we also want to account for kind of the typical situation of, you know, how these things get built, you know, how you don't negatively impact your neighbors, how you can have some flexibility, like maybe you want to move the building a little bit to protect an old tree. Or, I mean, I think things like that we would want to apply for, but we want to have the basics kind of in place because this is a new type of housing that we haven't introduced into these areas. And so we just want to be thoughtful about it.
Great, thanks.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
So there's 9 middle housing types, right? And you're asking for input on 6. What are the 3 and why are you're not recommending or you don't think those other 3 would be successful?
Yeah, sorry, we did the diagram with just the first 6. We're going to update this. We had done these diagrams for the workshop, so we will add those in. In the first slide, we have all 9. So these are 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So of those, which were the 3 that you don't think you would recommend then?
Well, I just think the stacked flats, you know, seem a little intense to me for some of the single-family neighborhoods. I think the stacked flats, like, you know, when we talk about the future land use map, we're talking about having a urban residential designation, so something that's like the areas that aren't single-family right now, or the areas maybe on the edges of centers, maybe in that location. Again, that's not part of the 1110 bill, but you could allow a typology like that. It's hard to see the stacked flats for me in Sammamish low-density neighborhoods, both from a practicality standpoint, but also kind of a aesthetic standpoint. So for what it's worth, I think that seems like a little bit of an unrealistic typology. So what I was saying is even if you took the first 6, duplex, triplex, fourplex, sixplex, townhouses, and cottage cluster, you know, that's a pretty good range of styles.
I'd also add that courtyard apartments tend to require additional land and tend to push the building bulk out to the perimeter of the property, which would impact adjacent single-family homes and would really not go over too well. So that's one thing to consider as well.
They might have also actually listed the 5-plex, which we didn't have in here. So I guess our preliminary recommendation is I think you could pick the first 6, starting at duplex, and be in, you know, pretty good shape and introduce a lot of different housing typologies, but the ones that are most compatible with the single-family neighborhoods.
And to be clear, single-family DADU and ADUs are already included under a separate legislation,
Yeah.
so.
So that's not one of your choices, but that will happen anyway. So if you have a single-family home or a single-family property, you can have 2 tracks. You could do the single-family and up to 2 ADUs, or you could do the sort of the middle housing option, which would give you all all the options that we select.
Aren't the stacked flats similar to when you talk about the mid-rise for town center?
They are somewhat similar. I mean, that's a narrower footprint building, but yeah, that's over 4 stories. I would consider getting into the mid-rise.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a
So
good
then,
point.
for me, then I would say all of them except for the courtyard apartments, if, given what David said, I would go for that.
Okay.
Councilmember Trine?
Yeah, so if I have to choose, then we do the first 6. Actually, I'd eliminate the 6-plex and go to the 5-plex, but all right, whatever. And then write the regulations well, because what follows is not going to be pretty. So I do have one question, just because I'm curious. Has already there been legal action against House Bill 110 yet? Have we heard of any? Just checking.
Not that
I haven't heard any yet either. So figure it's coming.
Keep in mind, there's also another bill that was passed, that was presented regarding design review. So the
Right.
city has limited ability to impose design review standards that are not concrete, that are not simple to understand. And we also have a limitation on the permit process and the number of days that we're allowed to process permits. So it's shaping up to be quite a complex implementation experience for us.
Yeah, again, taking away the power of the city. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Councilmember Stewart? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, thanks. My recommendation is that we have a really great TDR program, because again, I think that from an environmental sustainability perspective, I think we'd prefer to get that density into the centers as opposed to, kind of randomly throughout the neighborhoods. But I know that you still have to plan for this, so I'm fine with the first 6. And David, I think we heard from Redmond, right? One of the things we do want to do is make sure we do have those design standards. I know they have to be simple and straightforward and consistent with the single families, but I think that's going to be really important in this case, is to have those design standards so that we get that at least somewhat consistency when we start to see some of this. I'm sure there are going to be exceptions to this, but I feel like in so many of our neighborhoods, the lot sizes aren't huge, so we're probably not going to see a whole lot of like 6-plexes, right? Just from because I thought we had a floor to area ratio. I know we don't have a minimum lot size, but I thought we did implement a floor to area ratio.
We do, but it hasn't, we would have to update that for these housing types, but yes, we do. We have that in place.
Yeah.
So if you wanted a preview of what this might look like in implementation, I'd suggest spending some time driving around the city of Shoreline in the station areas, specifically around the 185th between I-5 and Aurora. There are quite a few examples of these popping up in single-family neighborhoods. Some of them are done really well and fit really well within the neighborhood. You can't really tell the bulk of the building is there. Some of them are done in a way that I wouldn't do it that way. And it's pretty clear that the neighbors are very much affected by it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we definitely want that. And again, I'd prefer to see the density in a center where we can have transit and we can actually make transit more efficient, as opposed to adding it sprinkled throughout all of our neighborhoods in all of our 750 cul-de-sacs around the city. So I think that's going to be our challenge, right? Is yes, we have to plan for this and have all of the code there and ready for it, but hopefully we can find ways to build things much more efficiently and sustainably. Thanks.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with picking the first 6. That seems to be a good way to go. And seeing, when we're go forward with all the new changes from House Bill 1110, we're looking at putting some of this housing in existing neighbourhoods. I'm not so sure stacked flats, how that would go down, and really thinking about people in those neighbourhoods already and how that affects their living situation. So I do think about that. So I think the first 6 would probably work. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, I'm the last. I also agree, first 6, starting with the duplex. Not that you asked, but I do like the alley configuration, definitely. So anything else, council? Okay, what else do you have for us?
I don't even remember at this point. We'll see. Future land use map. So questions are just, what does the council see as the role of the future land use map? And maybe you don't know an answer to that quite yet. But I think the context here, and this is true in a lot of cities that we're working with right now, is they have a zoning map that's just a copy of their a future land use map that's a copy of their zoning map, right? The future land use map is supposed to be more of a planning tool, you know, sort of irrespective of maybe how you're going to achieve it, right? You can identify like greenbelt areas, you can identify open space areas, you could identify things like maybe where you might want future neighborhood centers to go from. You can have higher level land use categories like town center or commercial mixed use center, and then have a set of districts that kind of go with it. So it becomes more like a plan of the city versus a carbon copy of the zoning map, right? And, you know, it's a little bit tricky to get there, but we have come up with some potential future land use map categories. So rather than just, again, going with the zoning, we think the categories would be town center, which is, of course, the town center, mixed use center, which would be all of the other centers outside of it, with the exception of the small neighborhood center on the Parkway. We think that would be more in line with what we would call a neighborhood center, which is sort of smaller scale, walkable, you know, neighborhood serving commercial and amenities, that kind of stuff, smaller scale. So we would only have one of those, and there could be the opportunity to designate future ones, whether that happens through this process or there's sort of a framework to do that as part of the plan adoption. And then that might start to build out, you know, some greater opportunities for middle housing, because I agree with Councilmember Stewart in some sense. In this country, we tend to just throw density wherever it can go, as opposed to aligning density with amenities. So if you have a neighborhood center, or you're near a school, or you're near, you know, someplace you could walk to, or whatever, you know, that has a very different feeling and gives you more of a reason to live in a, you know, that type of environment because of some of the amenities. For residential designations, we've suggesting 2 urban residential, which would be like the R12, 18 districts are today. There isn't a lot of capacity in those areas, but again, we might look at like a ring around some of the mixed use centers or neighborhood centers where we would allow a little bit higher density, you know, things that would maybe support things like stacked flats and other things in appropriate locations. And then neighborhood residential is what we would essentially be the existing single-family neighborhoods that would now allow for middle housing. There's also an opportunity to identify parks and open space land and forested lands. And even if, again, we don't maybe know how we might want to protect these would identify these as priorities, right? So we may say, well, this has a really great, you know, forested natural resource value. It's privately owned, but we're going to designate it on the map. And we're going to zone it something because we have to zone it something. But then we're going to use the plan to go talk to a land trust who's going to try to purchase the land. So it's sort of like decoupling your planning from your zoning. Whereas if you're just hyper-focused on zoning, you're sort of missing the opportunities for the planning aspect of it. You know, so it becomes, I think, a better tool. And then finally, just the public and institutional, you know, categories for things like City Hall and so on and so forth. So when you put that together, we kind of just took the existing future land use map and applied these new categories to it. And so this is kind of what it looks like, which is very similar. The blue dots are where schools are located, the little call outs. We have some forested lands in there, parks and open space. Neighborhood center is just that one existing center down there on the Parkway, and then the town center, and then the existing commercial center. So it's basically the same thing. This would kind of be more like alternative, the baseline alternative. And then again, we did this as an exercise in the staff workshop, and so this would identify potentially some combination of Inglewood and the town center as sort of a co-planning area. Don't know exactly what that looks like, but they're so close to each other, and I think there's potentially some opportunity for some synergy there. You could look again at that ring of sort of urban residential around it. So now you're talking about higher densities in areas where you can walk to amenities, which is great. And we have shown some opportunities for that around some of the other centers. And then we just kind of highlighted in the circle, just very conceptually, you know, where we might want to think about new neighborhood centers. These are not formal designations. There might be multiple avenues for these to get designated. Could be a private citizen requesting amendment to the comp plan or a designation. It could be somewhat opportunistic, you know, where there's available land or opportunity. Could happen as part of a future, you know, planning effort, could happen as part of a planned unit development, or maybe we allow a little bit of commercial development and that becomes a neighborhood center. So I think there's multiple paths, but again, as a planning tool, it starts to give you some insights around how you can co-locate infrastructure, amenities, and housing and stuff all in one location or in multiple locations. And then finally, the parks and open space and forested land. So this is very high level and kind of conceptual. Again, it just came out of our workshop, but we just wanted to share our thinking about this and how we think it could be a better tool. It'd be great to have, you know, eventually a giant map of this in City Hall. And, you know, if you wanted to look at the plan in one map, then there it is. And I think this will be much more useful than what we have today.
In addition to that, and I agree with everything Jeff said, one additional benefit here is that, and this kind of answers some of the questions we had earlier tonight about the relationship between capacity, the growth target, what the population forecast, is that you can actually park some of your capacity in the future land use map, and you can hold that until such a time as the infrastructure is available to support it, and then you can go through an administrative rezone process to actualize it, activate it in zoning. So what you can do is you can set the zoning to match what it currently is today, set the future land use map to show what you want it to be, and then add specific criteria that is required to be met in order for you to go through the rezone process, but make the rezone process fairly simple to get through, not like our Santoni experience. So the idea there is that you're able to put the capacity in place, show in the comp plan how you're providing the planning for growth in the future. But one of the safeguards is that in order for the development to actually happen, you have to then go through the administrative rezone process, which is criteria driven. And one of the criteria might be that you've demonstrated adequate infrastructure at the time of the rezone. So that is a method of ensuring there's that check valve in place to make sure that we're not going to see development outpace our ability to provide infrastructure. This is really common in many other cities. I know that there's some great criteria I've seen I've actually used in other cities where I've worked. And it's a pretty high bar at times to get through the rezone process, but you don't want to set it up so high that it doesn't actually happen in the long term.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you can also set up future sub-area planning too. So you could identify an area, not change the zoning, and then, you know, move into a sub-area plan update, which can be done outside of a typical update, you know, the limitations on annual updates. So.
Is this the last slide, or do you have the question slide? Perfect. Councilmember Trine?
Thank you. So first is you need a couple more, I think, groups on your little map. But one, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's Rock Meadows, and you need to keep it. Call it Bridal Trails of Sammamish or whatever you want to call it, but that's horse country, and if you go changing that, it's zoned special. It's a very unique area in our city. It's a little gym, and that needs to be protected. And so, I mean, I'm like almost heading the opposite direction of what you guys, in a sense, what I was hearing. But that has to be an area that has to be identified on your futures map, because that's there now, and it needs to be there in the future. The work those people do up there is amazing, and the benefit that is not only to the environment, but also to the mental health of the residents who use those facilities. And programs that are being offered up there is amazing. So that's definitely a futures thing. That's not something I'm talking about. It's not so much about conservation, preservation, and enhancement. So that's my next one. Where are my wildlife corridors? That's a futures map. So wildlife corridors are definitely need to be added into this. It's more than just your forested lands. David, you and I know, I've talked to you about this for 5 years. We need to start planning for an ultimate build out. This is at least a step in the right direction. So I'd urge that we do the hard work, plan this thing out, and get a futures map, separate it out so that it's in our comp plan, so that there's a clear path forward for where we're headed. Not only will the residents appreciate that, but the developers will also appreciate it as well. What I need to know is, look, I'm not going to go build my house until I know what the finished product looks like. So we've been young, a city that's been young and not wise. So at this point, let's do the hard work. Let's look and see what the finished product looks like so that we can then start planning some of our long-range goals. It leads right into, okay, I'm off subject here for just a second, so point of privilege is it fits right into our TMP. And I know this isn't about the TMP, but this futures map is about all the elements that are going into the land use, which includes transportation. It will help us with our transportation master plan, which then drives for us what we're doing on our TIP. It also is facilities, parks. It goes on. So yes, do it. Let's do it. Get it. Let's do the hard work and get this thing finished. Thank you.
Councilmember Napure?
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification on what you describe as the prospective neighborhood centers. What does that
Yeah, it would just
include?
mean something like neighborhood business zoning. So it might be like allowing for like small scale, commercial or mixed use buildings. There would probably be limits on size and scale. Maybe either just around a key intersection or a small block area. I mean, we could show you some examples of it, but it's just like a block or two of kind of neighborhood serving retail that you could walk to, or, maybe there's some apartments above. They can be difficult to pull off because of, logistics around land ownership and infrastructure, but if you start to put forth the vision for them now, then I think there's an opportunity to do it. So again, nothing like the centers you have now. Wouldn't be like a grocery store attracting, from a wide area. It'd be very kind of small scale.
And then my second question was, so the future land use proposed map, this is again from a perspective of are we looking at it from the lens of HB 1110, or are we looking at it from like planning for 2044?
Yeah, I would say both.
Both.
If we looked at our idealized land use pattern, somewhat irrespective of how we achieve that solely through zoning, again, what would it look like, right?
So then my question is that given that we know a lot of Sammamish is covered by HOAs, does it make sense to represent that as well on this map? And of course, there could be lawsuits and it could go either way, but does that help with
I would
planning?
be hesitant to do that, A, because it would be difficult to know them all, and B, to Councilmember Howe's point, they could end up getting changed, and I'd rather not draw attention to it in that way. So I guess I wouldn't recommend doing that, because unless that was our idealized vision of what we wanted, that's, I think, what the tool is for. So.
But isn't that what is practical? I mean, that's what we're going to have to...
Well, that would be more like an existing land use map, which is another thing that would just show what's existing there today. So, unless we want that to be part of our idealized map for Sammamish in 2044, I wouldn't include that in there.
Okay. So on the future map, you've sort of grouped together, where you would want that density. I know at times we have like these neighborhood centers or even mixed-use centers right outside of the city. And is there plan to sort of, so using those amenities to build around that or to bring density around that?
Yeah, well, we had talked about that around Redmond. You know, if you do find yourself in a situation, we deal with this oftentimes with parks where they're like, you know, two cities are bordered by like the median of a road, right? And there's a park across the street, so feels silly not to count that as an amenity. So I think similarly, if in situations where we are adjacent to it, it could change our thinking around planning for that. Like maybe more density makes sense there. Maybe there's a transit line just outside the city that's close. So yeah, we absolutely should consider the surrounding context of our neighbors.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
Thank you. Yeah, I was excited to see this. I know this is something that we had talked about at Planning Commission probably back in 2018. So I think it's probably time Sammamish had two separate maps, one for zoning, one for future land use. I think it would help all of us get a, because I'm all about visual cues, but it would help a lot of us understand kind of what the city could potentially look like and where are all our fantastic resources. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made so far about this, and I do think it is really worth putting out on the map where those critical areas are and where all those, you know, if we're going to talk about preserving those that natural world in Sammamish, I think that's worth pointing that out. And when we call that out, then it's another way of saying that these are the things that are important to us. But I think we definitely need a future land use map. I like the second one. And I like some of the new things that you're proposing. Those prospective neighborhood centers possibly, you know, who knows what the future's going to bring. But yeah, I really like this. Great. Thank you.
So the other thing to keep in mind is that these maps relate back to the numbers that you saw earlier, the base number and the planning for 2044 number, they correspond to these maps. So the base map that you're seeing here existing is the 2100 unit map. The future land use map with the additional areas shown is the 5444 number. So that's where that would be accommodated. So you could see where that growth would be focused in the city based on that map.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I was just interested in the difference between the neighborhood center and the mixed-use center in terms of like what is really differentiating the two. The 7-Eleven area, it's a strip mall similar to the Pine Lake complex. I mean, there's a grocery store at the Pine Lake complex, but to me, they're kind of similar. Is it the location, or I'm not sure, like, do we need to like be very clear in how we define what a mixed-use center is and what qualifies as a neighborhood center? So of course, that would affect that area up to the north, the prospective neighborhood center.
Yeah, so there's absolutely more work to do to define those. The little center that's on the Parkway is actually a different zoning district. I think that's the only part of the city that has that district. So that's kind of what we're starting with, but I think what we would come up with for any neighborhood center zoning would be something new and kind of customized. So again, you might have less intense uses, maximum maybe building footprints, limits on, say, large surface parking lots, maybe limitations on the scale of, just the size of the actual businesses themselves and sort of where they're drawing from. So I think it would just be a ratcheting down kind of all of those things to create something that's small scale and fits in well with the neighborhoods. And I don't think we would just plug and play with that existing district. We'd come up with some modified version of that. We would make sure is aligned with the community goals for those. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Does anyone else have thoughts on this last question before I go? Yeah, I like where we're going. I like where we're headed. I think my input is a local coffee shop inside of an independent bookstore inside of a local hardware store.
Well, let me tell you a good story.
Yes, yeah.
Encouraging, kind of fun story. Because a lot of this is like you're looking at data and, it can be kind of discouraging. But we're, one of the things that we do with hopefully we do some of this in Sammamish too, but we do a lot of work in downtown planning. And we've been working with the city of Pasco for the last year or so, and they hired us to come back after they adopted their plan. And the city's just super excited about implementing the plan. And one of the things that we looked at in the plan is there is this building that was sort of dilapidated but seemed to have a lot of potential right next to their new downtown public space. And so we had done this rendering of it and showed it turning into a cafe, and they have this little like building setback and there's this plaza and all this stuff. We were really excited by it, but you know, it's just done in Photoshop or whatever, so it's not real. But now we were just there a couple weeks ago, and a member of the Arts Commission, who's also an art teacher, purchased the building, has repainted it, and is opening an arts/coffee shop in the space. And we got to meet with them and working with them on kickstarting a public art program. And so, you know, again, they had the space to work with, but, you know, these things can happen, and it's just really excited. We're excited for them. And if you ever have a chance to go to Pasco, they have a great farmer's market. It's a really interesting community. And so, I don't know, we're hoping that they have great success and it really becomes an asset for the community, because that was the number one thing that they wanted in their downtown, is a coffee shop, which they don't have. So we'll do our
No, that's
best.
great. That's really cool. Might be the only reason I would go to Pasco, but I would love it. Absolutely love it. All right.
You just described my neighborhood with where we have exactly that, an independent bakery with an independent
Really?
bookstore with an Ace Hardware. right
Oh, I
next to
mean,
each
that is
other.
my
Yep.
dream. Yeah, that's so good. Did you have anything else, Jeff and David?
That's it. I really
Awesome.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Aaron, I think we'll call it a night. I'm just kidding, yeah. Let's take 10 minutes though while we swap, if that's okay. All right, 9:10.
Yeah, actually, if you want to just take this,
Yeah.
I can get another one.
That is
That's
so
been-
interesting, but it's so challenging from a building code perspective.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
But I love the idea. It's prefabbed units. There's no interior walls. You put in the wall when you have money and time.
Maybe I should check it out. I'm going to be in Vermont for most of August, where I grew up, and maybe I could go to Montreal and check it out.
But I love about the way they organized this also. It's got the plan, and it's also got the pros and cons. So
Oh,
that
yeah.
you learn, you know, like what.
All right, welcome back. We are going to pass it on to Aaron for budget carry forward.
All right, Aaron Anton, Assistant Finance Director. I told you I'd be back. I'm back. Items that we wanted to cover, the budget carry forward, and what that means to our long-term operating forecast. So a quick explanation on the timeline, where we're at in our budget process as we move through. So recall November, we had the adopted 23-24 city budget. We talked about the first quarter update at our last May meeting. And then now we moved through May, and at the end of May, the data for 2022 year end is filed with the state auditor's office. So that brings us up to date. So here we are in June, reviewing now that we're closing out 2022 year end numbers. Then we can look at what that means for our fund balances and what that would mean for any requested budget carry forwards. So then we'll proceed on. The 20th is when the actual ordinance would be adopted, and then the other budget actions are listed there just in summary form for July through September, that activity that's then continuing into October, and the November public hearings, and then before November 30th. So the same timelines that you saw previously for our public hearings and property tax deadlines. So that's just a brief overview on the timeline. Again, the quarterly reports, monitoring reports continue throughout the year as those process. This slide is just a reminder that all of this information is available on the city's website. There's a lot of the quarterly financial management reports, the summary, 4-page summaries of those quarterly reports, and then obviously the meetings and minutes and all of that. So there's the website as well where those reports are. So quick reminder on where we begin with the budget, 23-24 budget. So this is what was adopted in November, and it was $309 million for all of these items and amounts and funds. So this is the total picture. On the left, we were breaking it up by the buckets. So you can see that little bucket logo. There's 4 different buckets that we were talking about, and we had our quarterly monitoring reports that were looking at those 4 bucket items. So I'm just showing the frame for where we started. So general operations being that first bucket. And then we'll walk through what the changes are that are being proposed here in this action. So we start with 309 million. There's the 4 buckets. Brief overview of those 4 areas. The first action that's really happening here is a true up of those balances. So now that we've closed out 2022, we're going to move the savings into 23 and update those beginning fund balances in 2023 in that budget document itself. So those numbers down at the bottom there are by those 4 bucket categories. So 4.7 million is in that general operations bucket category for fund balance. Internal risk services, risk IT and fleet, internal services, that's the 378,000. The surface water utility, 280,000, 1.8 million in the capital funds. The total true up amount for fund balances, that change, that's the 6.5 million. So that ties to what you saw on the agenda packet when you look at that table that just adds up all by the funds, lists all of the funds versus just the 4 categories of funds here that we're looking at. So next, after the balances are updated, is we're going to look at what the carry forward requests are for budget carrying forward into the next biennium. So this is also in the agenda packet as well. It goes through each of these items. There's 7 of them for the general fund. So we're looking at general operations. There's 1 in capital. There's 7 in general fund. These are those descriptions and amounts. So it walks through these. There's a little further description in the agenda packet on each one of these as well. It's adding up for a total request of $289,400. I am noting that engineering project review services, that $73,000 request, and I know we had a question on that. So that's related to a revenue reimbursed item. So you're going to have an expenditure adjustment that comes in, and then the revenue adjustment comes and offsets that expenditure. So both of those come together. So it's going to net to 0, but you're going to see a revenue line increase for the revenue, and the expenditure is going to go up by that same amount for that $73,000 for that particular one. So what that means to the total, the $289,400, it's going to be offset $73,000 in revenue. So you're going to see that as we roll into general operations. This is the total picture of what's happening there. You're going to see revenues, and that $73,000 is rolled into that first line where it's showing $247,966. The other thing that's happening on revenues is the ARPA revenues that are truing up coming into that fund. So that's what's bringing that total to $247,966. On the expenditure line, that $289,400 is the same number on the previous slide. So if you're looking for detail on those 7 requests, it's all broken out on the previous slide. So the other items here are just calculations. What does that mean? So net revenues less expenses in the general operations. So in total, after the carry forward adjustments are approved, it's a negative $41,434. So negative in the sense that the net adjustment to fund balance is going to be $41,000 because revenues are offsetting expenses. So you just have a net amount that's hitting fund balance of $41,000. So then the next block goes through what does that mean for the balances? So recall the 4.7 million, that was from that slide where we were truing up the fund balances. Now we're going to net out that 41,000 that's from above, which is the carry forward request, both the revenue expenses that net to 41. So your ending fund balance then is going to be 4.6 million, 4,678,533. So that's what the resulting ending fund balance will be once we've trued it up with these adjustments. The strategic reserve, that's just informational piece there that just shows you where that 10% policy amount was at. Okay, so then the only other carry forward adjustment, that was all general fund operations. The other one was we had one of our capital funds, the Parks Capital Fund, for that skate park project. That amounted to $283,365. So that's the other carry forward. And this just gives you a picture of what's happening in the Parks Capital Fund then. So with that carry forward adjustment, the net ending fund balance over there is $700,098. So what does that mean overall for 2024? So we just talked about closing 2022, moving the money into 23, then we had some carry forwards. What happens with 24? Well, that carries through. We're not making any adjustments to the revenue and expenditures in 24. So that fund balance savings that we just moved from 22 to 23 now flows through to 24. And so that's what this is showing is the net adjustment to that ending fund balance, the $4,678,533. That's coming into the 2024 budget adjustment. And that brings our adjusted 2024 ending fund balance now up to $36,594,314. And this is in the operating fund. So that's, again, for reference, the 10% reserve policy is shown. So there's the concept of what's available after reserve. That's also something that we look at when we're making the adjustment itself. So after that 10%, it's just taking that allocation out of the 36 million, and it's showing you what is it available after you adjust for that, and it's 30 million. So it's comparing that to what you had originally, 24 budget number, had that same ending fund balance, was budgeted at 31.9 million, had a 10% reserve policy level at that at 5.5 million. So it was available, ending fund balance was 26.4. Now it's going to be going up to 30.6 because we're moving that 4.6 million into the budget period. So that's what those adjustments will do. So carry forwards fund balance. This is what it looks like once we roll that into that same picture. So we started starting point, talk through the adjustments to fund balances and carry forwards. This is what the table will look like when it appears as an attachment to the ordinance on the 20th, which is going to be our next council meeting. This is going to be the Table A ordinance. So you'll recognize on that general operations line, the first line there all the way to the right, it has the $36,594,314. That's the same number that was just on the prior slide that was showing the total adjustment to ending fund balance. And then each of those fund balance numbers, and then our total budget is then going to be increased for the 2 years to $316 million. So that's the carry forwards and the fund balances. So moving, what does that mean to our forecast? So we're taking that's kind of the second topic of showing you what that look how it impacts the long-term forecast that we had previously had in place. So we didn't change any of the assumptions. Those would remain the same. We're just updating for the information that we just walked through. And then this will allow us to update that same data set to Baker Tilly, our contract for the 10-year financial sustainability plan. So that contractor will get this same information that we're giving you. So they'll have the most recent up-to-date data when they're doing their 10-year forecast. So here's what that 6-year forecast looked like. So this is just a reminder of what it was in February of 2023. So before we did the carry forwards and before we closed the year out, we were looking particularly, I'm going to zone in on 2028, where you can see that dropping below zero. So we had a 10% reserve target, and we're projecting to drop below. And then now with these adjustments, you're above the zero mark and just slightly below that 10% reserve mark in that same year, 2028. So those circles are showing what adjustments we're making with the fund balance. Basically, 2023 raises up a little bit because we're moving savings into that year, and then that carries through to 2028. So that's the update for the carry forwards, budgets, and what it means to our 6-year operating forecast. We will be back on the 20th with the ordinance itself that then council could adopt for moving those in for a 23-24 adjusted budget.
Scott, you know the questions are probably going to come about the not task force. What is it called?
Fiscal Sustainability Task Force.
That, yeah. I don't know if you want to mention that or if you will at your city manager report. I just assume there might be questions about that with that forecast. And if not, that's okay too.
Well, Mayor, I'm happy to just take a quick run at that just while we're on this topic. I think that shows that, it definitely changes the ending point. However, it doesn't change the fact that we still have, over time, we have an operating deficit that is due to our tax structure. And that's part of the work that the Fiscal Sustainability Group will do. And as part of what will come back is how do we address that, the structural gap? I think that's the bigger issue. And so that's the work that still needs to be done. And just to be clear, this is assuming that we don't do anything else with what's in fund balance at the moment. And so that's the other part about this, is that we just have to be clear about the fact that this is still a short-term stopgap, and we have a long-term issue to address.
Councilmember Howe?
Excuse me, my question has to do with the reserve, because at one point, I think it was suggested to us that we reserve more, and I thought it was 12%. And I know that this doesn't reflect that because we have not discussed that or looked at bumping it up, but I would be looking at some point for a recommendation on that based on where we are.
Sure, thank you, Councilmember. And we just had this conversation, was it this morning? God, the days are all, with the consultants, where they were saying, this is one of the things that they intend on coming back and revisiting with council when we get there about what our reserve policy will be. Council will recall, well, some of you recall, because we had this conversation before a couple council members were actually seated, that we had an initial conversation about what the reserve policy would be. And for the moment we held, council chose to hold it steady at that 10% rate. But I do think this will be one of the pieces that we come back with, in part because we are a property tax dependent city, and we don't have as much in terms of other revenue sources.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Great. Yeah. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all. I know you'll be back soon. What do we have next? Audrey? Snow and Ice Management Program Level of Service Selection.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council. Audrey Starcy, Harding Public Works Director, and I'm very excited to bring forward our snow and ice conversation with you. We were last in front of Council, I believe, April 18th, where we introduced this item. I know for most in the community, snow and ice isn't really something they're thinking about, but we start our preparations in March for the upcoming year. So really looking forward to the discussion with Council this evening, and just please give me a minute while I get my screen shared. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we did provide an overview to Council in December of 2022. I think that the intent of that conversation was that we would be ahead of snow and ice season, but as you recall, we had that early snow event last November, so it was actually great timing. It turned out it was right in the middle of it. And then we introduced this level of service conversation in April of earlier this year. We have done some work on our numbers to bring back some impacts to the budget and to the community if we were to consider a different level of service. And we are here this evening just asking for a direction, and we'll be back in September with our updated snow and ice management plan. As I mentioned in my introduction, we start well in advance of the actual snow and ice season. So we are right now planning our resources for the next year. So this conversation is very timely. And just a quick reminder, this plan is something that is identified in our 2023 work plan, and we are moving along right on schedule. So really looking forward to continuing the discussion. A few of these slides might look a little familiar, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. again, this is just the direction this evening will help us inform and update our plan. Our current plan is well over 10 years old. It is long overdue for an update, and we would like to incorporate some of our new things that we've been working on as a city this last year, our climate action plan, and some of our vehicle miles traveled, our reduction strategy, into some of our plan as much as possible, while it's still adhering to our goals for the snow and ice management plan to provide public safety for our main roads during snow and ice and events. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then at the same time, we'll be working on our program implementation guide that'll be a staff resource for those snow and ice events. I went through this a little bit in further detail in April, but just as a quick reminder, these are our bigger snow response phases. For the most part, the discussion this evening will center around that third phase. So it's once we complete our snow removal on our priority routes 1 through 4. That's kind of what the difference is between these level of services all in that third phase once we move into the residential streets. And again, I'll kind of move through this fairly quickly. We have a lot of program updates that we'll be looking at this year, regardless of level of service. A lot of those will come in the form of communication tools, web page and website updates, as well as a significant update and overhaul to our map. We're also looking at bringing a simulator training to the city, possibly partnering with some other East Side cities to provide that training collaboratively, and looking at a few different equipment opportunities, some different plow blade attachments that could help reduce the amount of materials that we're using. Just a quick summary, as you can see the chart on the upper right of your screen, we were definitely over budget for our snow and ice supplies. That budget line item, for the most part, is our materials that we use on the roadways. So both our ice slicer, our rock salt, as well as our calcium chloride with Boost or CCB. We used quite a bit over this last season. Those amounts reflected both the amount that we used throughout the winter season, and to, for the most part, restock so that we're fairly prepared for this next winter season. We will need to order a little bit more supplies in September, October, again, depending on level of service selected this evening. I will circle back to this chart. There's a lot of information here, but I wanted to summarize for council. So a lot of the differences, like I said, with level of service are presented once we move into the residential streets. And as I walk through each one of these options, I do have a few photos so you can kind of see what that would look like in terms of impact to the community. I also wanted to just kind of point out on the bottom, we did try to estimate the amount of materials that we would most likely see a reduction if we chose a different level of service. The city currently operates at option 4, so we service all of our roads in Sammamish down to bare pavement. So our crews operate 24 hours a day until all those roads are clear. But the other side of that is we use a lot of materials and it's very expensive. So our first level of service option for your consideration this evening is the bare minimum, if you will. With all of these options, the pre-treatment would never change. Some of our program improvements would be consistent with all of our level of service options. So this particular option would only consider plowing and treatment on our priority 1 through 4 roads only. Residential roads that aren't in those prioritized routes would not be serviced at all. So our arterials and minor arterials would look like similar to this photo. We do service those routes curb to curb. Our residential streets would kind of look like the blue squares. And as I go through each one of these options, the green boxes typically refer to plowing and treatment. I tried to color coordinate those with the photos. The blue boxes will refer to just what the streets would look like if we only plowed or didn't service them at all. And of course, the dark blue boxes are the impacts to both budget and quantity materials used. The second option for your consideration this evening has everything that's included in option 1, but we've added on a partial service for our residential streets in longer storms. So this is really meant to capture some plowing that may need to happen, excuse me, during those storm events that are longer, or that we are maybe anticipating a higher amount of snowfall that would fall. So you can see that the amount of materials that we're estimating would definitely increase, as well as the budget. This option also includes our priority 5 roads, and this is a new priority system that we are developing this summer. It primarily focuses on our hills and our very steep routes that we would need to improve safety on local roads. The third option includes everything in option 2, but in this option we will partially service our residential roads. So that is a big difference for what the community has typically expected. So we would still plow our residential streets, but we would not use any of our product when we are removing the snow on our residential streets. So the streets would likely look very similar to that picture in that blue circle. And our fourth option for your consideration this evening is our status quo. It's what we have been providing to the city. We use a lot of material, and it's very expensive. However, it does provide an excellent level of service to the community. That we do fully service all of our roads in a prioritized system, but we service down to bare pavement for our arterials, and our residential streets we service to bare pavement in our travel lanes only. Like I said, it does come with a cost. Following our discussion this evening, like I said, we'll have a lot of work and updates that we'll be doing on the back end, and we will be back to council in September. And that concludes my presentation for this evening, and happy to turn it back over to you, Mayor, for questions and discussion.
Councilmember Ndapure.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Audrey. Can you help me understand what do you mean by improve safety on local roads? Like, what does that exactly look like? Because safety can mean different things, but especially when it's snow and ice, what does that mean?
That's a great question. This is if that level of service was selected, this just offers the community an opportunity for staff to identify some areas throughout the city, actually, where you have them identified that have steeper hills that are maybe see a little bit more traffic within our residential roads, that we would identify as something that we would need to service, regardless if we're only plowing the rest of the roads or not plowing the rest of the roads. These might be some steeper hills that we would want to plow and treat, so that we're avoiding ice really on the roads.
Okay. And then I know you mentioned that we do option 4 right now for our city. When did we start doing that, and what was the sort of level that we have? I mean, I know we have not put these levels so specifically, but what was the service that was provided maybe 4 years ago? And then when did we start level 4?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, I think we have always provided this service level to the city. So I can circle back and confirm. Again, every storm is different, so in every storm season is different, but to my knowledge, we've always serviced every road in the city, which is quite unusual.
Okay. I would love to know the details on that, if you can find more information.
Sure, I can follow up.
Yep,
Absolutely.
because I have some different experiences, so.
Okay.
Thanks.
Audrey, in your humble opinion, what is the best option?
This is a great question, and thank you, Mayor. We have discussed this internally as staff. I would recommend either option 2 or 3, and we can try it out for a year and see how that goes. That still provides service to the residential streets, but it's at a reduced amount, and it's something that we could more than likely stay within our budget, very close to it, and it still allows service to those residential areas. And we could also reduce the amount of materials that we're using and staff time as well.
No, that's great. I mean, initially I think I was thinking option 3, but I didn't know if that brought you down enough. You know, it like dropped down a couple hundred tons of stuff. So that's super helpful. Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah,
I'm assuming when you come back in September, that's when you'll have like the total numbers to give us the estimates on what the total budget savings would be, because I think that just had the savings on the materials. Is that right?
Yes, and it's something that, again, these would all be estimates. It really depends on
Sure.
the type of storm season that we have. But this is kind of depending, yeah, we do have the amount of hours that we've spent, for example, overtime. I think we've spent
Yeah.
600 to 800 hours of overtime this last storm season alone,
Yeah.
just on snow and ice. So yeah, we can take a look at that too.
My only request would be if we did go with like an option 2 or 3, where you have those roads, those residential roads that you would want to plow and possibly treat anyway, to just designate them as the level 5 or whatever, so that it's not like yet another category or something, right? So people would be able to follow. And one of my requests is that we get a new map that we can read better. But I think it'll also be much improved because we didn't have the cameras last year, so for the whole year. So that's really helpful too. Thanks, Audrey.
Sure.
Nope. Councilmember Howe?
Unfortunately, this is the one thing our residents actually see and measure us on as a city. It's our visible support and safety. I struggle with letting go of the current standard of service because they really don't have any window into the services for the city, except this is really visible. It's really visible. And it was commented on how well you guys executed this prior year. My question kind of comes to also just from a practicality point of view. You talked about overtime. How realistic that we're even going to have staff to offer that level of service at a level 4 like it is today without decimating your staff? Because that might be an argument residents would understand, that we struggle to staff a 24-hour type of a program. But maybe you could help me understand that.
Sure, it's something that we were able to staff this last year, but I think the really challenging part happens when you have back-to-back storms, right? And so they are just working around the clock for weeks at a time, because our response doesn't end when most residents see us, I guess, ending service for snow removal. It continues for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks afterwards in terms of debris removal, restocking, taking inventory of our resources and ordering more. So it is a very long response time for city teams.
So I don't think we can actually vote on anything. Is that right?
I think what we're looking for here is some direction, if council has it,
Okay.
about which option to move forward with for planning purposes.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think you can certainly do, if you chose to, you could do a motion. That's not finalizing anything. This is just direction to staff.
Gotcha. So anyone else who has not spoken?
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, Deputy Mayor Lamb?
Is there an option 3B?
There could be. Do you have a proposal for option 3B?
Yeah, what's just like slightly less. I mean, I understand Councilmember Howe's point. I understand, Councilmember Stewart's point. I'm just trying to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, I think, we worked really hard to provide some very different levels of service that really had we're able to distinguish those levels. After that, it gets a little blurry if there's, 3B. And again, this is as resources allow. So we might have a storm event that we are never able to move off our priority 3 roads, right? We might have a storm event that's relatively quick, and if a higher level of service is selected in general, we can move into the neighborhood areas very quickly as well. So it is one of those things that's very hard to determine how we'll respond in every single storm, because every single storm is different. There's so many different factors that go into it. But in general, we just need to know for planning purposes. Like I said, we just kind of went ahead nod tonight so that we can come back in September with a plan that reflects council's goals and objectives for our response in general.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
Thank you, Audrey. And I agree with Councilmember Howe. This is a tough one because you know, this is one of those few things that we are all judged on by the public as to how good a job we are doing, especially at ease of getting around the city during the storm. And so if we had to go to a lesser option, because obviously option 4 would be my preference, and I know we're trying to keep an eye on our budget and wherever we can make savings. So I would be in favor of going down to option 3, but not below that. And then I noticed as well in our costings, we don't have a cost for fuel in there. So fuel, you know, who knows what the cost of fuel is going to be. If we end up having a much worse winter storm than anticipated that option 3 can't cope, we will obviously then have to go to option 4, as it were, in terms of covering all our roads and clearing everything. Is that kind of how that goes? If we get a heavier winter storm than anticipated, that we will end up having to do that anyway?
It depends on the type of storm and the type of how much material we have on hand, right? So we do have the opportunity or the availability to store, I think, 35,000 gallons of our de-icer, for example. So we have the storage capabilities, and we will be fully stocked up this winter storm. But it really is very important to us that we are very consistent with how we are responding in the storm as well. I imagine our new communications manager would also be reflecting that similar sentiment too. So we do have the opportunity to be flexible a little bit with our response. So this is, but in general, this is the guidance that we need to have so that we can make sure that we do have the right quantities of material. There have been some storms in the last few years where that all the passes, right, have been closed. And so most cities had a really hard time receiving more resources. So it becomes very challenging once you have back-to-back storms that just keep going to get those resources in as well.
Thank you.
Councilmember, Scott, do you want to jump in? Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, I definitely think, so I can't remember when, but it wasn't actually all that long ago that we didn't actually have plows. So this has not always been our level of service. And so you guys did a phenomenal job this last year, but I don't think it's sustainable. And I actually think it's really bad for the environment. So I think when we kind of look at the budget impacts, the staff impacts, and the impacts to the environment, I think a slightly lower level of service actually makes sense, and I think it helps to balance everything. I think a big part of it's going to be the communication, right, and being able to clearly articulate to people what we do, what the expectation is, having the clear maps, having the cameras, and I think we can manage the expectations. But we talked about it before, right? You guys are using materials that are less bad for the environment, but none of them are great, right? That de-icer stuff is not necessarily the best thing in the world. We got folks who are concerned about their pets. It can affect the salinity of the water, which can affect the fish. So I definitely feel like we can find a balance that still keeps our roads safe, but doesn't cost as much, and can set us up for success if we do have those back-to-back storms. So I would definitely, I'd like to see like option 2 and 3 sort of penciled out from a budget perspective to see what the differences are, right? So we can make a good, sound decision there. Thanks.
Councilmember Trine.
Audrey, it's real simple for me. It's safety first, so option 4. Thank you. Back to you, Mayor.
Scott.
Thank you, Mayor. Just really quickly, I want to thank Audrey and the team for really doing a deep dive into this and bringing forward options for all of you. One of the things that Audrey might have undersold a little bit, so I'll put in a pitch for our crews, is that when we go into 24-hour, that means everybody, that includes all the parks folks, are called in for these 24-hour shifts. So you may have noticed during these winter storms that the parks close. The parks are closed because we don't have any staff to go out and inspect them after there's an event and branches fall and trees possibly fall. And so that's why the parks are closed until we start to ramp the event down, and then we can actually release staff to go back out and start checking parks and reopening them. So I just want to be clear about, when there is an event on the horizon, we start to put staff on standby. When we think snow or freezing temperatures are coming, we go out and we pre-treat if possible. So there's a lot more than just the event itself that we're doing prep work, and we're using materials to try to get ready. So I think I just wanted to call that out because I think it's important to understand that when we do go into the option 4 and we're in 24-hour shifts, that does take absolutely everybody that we have on staff to be able to do that. And that's why part of what you saw in there is we sometimes house staff in hotels because they're too tired to drive home, and it's not safe, especially if the roads are clear. And as you all know, many, if not all of our staff do not live anywhere close to town for those that are driving the snow plows. So I just wanted to put a shout out for our teams that do all this work. It's what they do is pretty impressive. And this next year, if you have the chance to come out and maybe we can do some, when we do our snowplow route prep, it was illuminating for me to go out with one of the snowplow drivers for one of the big plows and watch what he did driving that thing around and not hitting cars and mailboxes and all that other stuff. It's a definite skill. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation just to help clarify what all we put into the overall snow and ice removal plan.
So Audrey, I think we are averaging out at between 3 and 4, it seems. I can't tell which is stronger. I don't know. I think with all that being said, I'm still for 3. So I don't really know what that means.
I think we can work with that. Thank you very much, Mayor. We have at least direction, and we'll come back with a draft plan for council's consideration in September.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey. And I think Dan will vouch for me that I am ready to take a shift in the plow.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks. So next, I think we have public comment. And we do have 10 minutes left. So we'll see if we have anybody for public comment, and we might need to extend.
Just one moment, please. I see currently 2 hands raised, and I only see 2 attendees.
All right, I'm going to move to extend the meeting to 10:10.
Second.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, thanks, Lita.
Okay, thank you. I will promote the first caller. Mary Wichter?
Hi, good evening. This is Mary Wichter, Sammamish, 23 years. I actually, when I moved here, I remember that the city didn't even have a pickup truck with a blade on it. And then I know when Glenna Krumoff was here, I think in about 2017, there was a city council meeting where he actually brought the first snowplow truck that the city owned and parked it outside so they could see it. So it hasn't always been at that level. I also, I live between Zakoos and George Davis Creeks, and Lewis Thompson Road most of the water goes into Zakoos Creek. I had originally talked with Public Works Director, former Steve Lenishevsky, and said, hey, instead of using the chemicals here, could you, use more naturally, less harsh stuff like sand or something. So they did try that for a year or 2, but I think it wasn't working. So it is hard on the environment. So if there's a way you can reduce tonnage but still try to keep people safe, I think that would be worthwhile. And then with regard to financial sustainability, I had written in some information and spoken to it once. And then on May 25th, if you search your emails using Urban3, URBAN and the number 3, you'll pop up my email that I had sent in with that 10-minute video done by Strong Towns on how if the tax density when you have a center area, how that tax density really helps. And there's also a 3D viewer that I gave you from Bozeman, Montana, that is also part of the Urban 3 studies that comes from Strong Towns. So I think that's very worth seeing if you haven't seen that. I know I give a lot of public comment, but if you just search for URBAN with the number 3, you'll be able to pop that up. And like I said, it's 10 minutes and very worthwhile because financial sustainability affects everybody. And then I just wanted to say what a great meeting tonight. Housing and land use are super important. And I thought the comments were really, really excellent and so many questions. I did want to just say a few things so on neighborhood business, I do think the future land use map is essential. And on neighborhood business, it could be things like you could have a child care center, like there's a kinder care just out on East Lake Sammamish Parkway in Redmond. You could have a place that pick up packages. A lot of people are experiencing package theft. You could have an exercise facility and indoor play area. You could have a place that takes care of pets just in your local community so people don't have to drive everywhere. So I think just about everything that was presented on the housing by David Pyle and Jeff from Framework and all the comments from council members was really good. Missing middle housing is missing. We need it. And then whenever you can, you need to put stuff in centers, because when you put it in centers, you end up with less costs for streets and roads. And then just to remind you, Sammamish Plateau Water, based on current zoning, can take up zoning capacity up to almost 28,000 ERUs with a population of 92,000. They serve only about 3/4 or a little bit more of this city, and they can reach growth rates in 2026. So you can do the planning ahead, even if you go with the lower numbers. I think the town center needs to be
Thank
bigger.
you.
I think the 5544 is a little bit too low. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I'll promote the next caller. Paul Stickney.
Good evening, City Council. Paul Stickney, Sammamish. Appreciated all the conversation tonight on the land use and housing issue. There's a lot to it. I appreciate many different people sharing their truths and their diverse opinions on this and the way it can go. A couple comments. In the housing needs assessment, there was a list with over 200 HOAs, and I've seen it, but I can't put my hands on it. I think there was a PRR done by somebody that had a list of all the contact people. So I think there could be some intel put together as to what percentage of the city would be under HOAs and not be changing. I think that's an important piece of information. And the other thing that I think would be interesting is, I know there's a few cities around the east side, Kirkland, I believe, Redmond. I know Seattle and King County do some in inclusionary zoning. I think it would be interesting to know what they do for in inclusionary zoning, and what are the percentages and at what AMI levels do they do the inclusionary. And the other thing I'm interested in is, what's the cost to produce a unit at roughly 30% AMI, 50% and 80% AMI, and who bears that cost and how does it relate? I think all good data. I agree with Councilmember Treen that land use is the issue. There are many different opinions on what that should be. I agree that the target for growth of 2,100 is cast in concrete at this time. But I would state, to go back, that maybe talking to the county and PSRC is important. And just to suggest this, I suggest that any of you on council who didn't watch all of the roughly 10 meetings about the growth target process, watch. And please don't think I'm being negative with this, but I want to be accurate. During all those meetings, there were several comments by council members at the time and staff that growth targets were minimums, minimums, minimums. There was no limit, and that was never true. Policy had changed. It was always consistency. The other thing that was talked about during, or not talked about during those meetings, is Sammamish has had over 1,300 affordable housing targets since 2003. Not once did that come up that, I recall. And the last comment is internal needs for all economic, demographic, and workforce were not quantified to be factored in to what our growth target negotiation was with the county. Anyway, I just tossed those things out there. And thanks again for a good chat tonight.
Thank you. Just double checking, that was 2 of 2.
If anybody else wishes to provide public comment, please raise your hand. I don't see any other hands raised. Thank you. Back to you.
Great,
Mayor.
thank you. City manager report.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I want to follow up on last week's meeting. I know there was a lot of conversation and public comment about things that we can do to help prepare and be better as we move forward. So some of the things that we're doing, and I want to reiterate the staff's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as part of what we are espousing at the staff level. And I know this is one of council's priorities as well. So I want to reiterate that. In light of the incident, however, we are going to work with the clerks, or you all get to work with the clerk staff to amend the council candidate questions to reflect a question or questions related to DEIB. And I think what we'd like to do, because we now have an open vacancy on the Planning Commission, is we'd like to propose kicking that process off next week so that we can get somebody seated by early July, because the Planning Commission has a lot of work to do and we are asking a lot. And it's going to take a little bit for someone to catch up, but the longer we wait, the harder that path is. So I think Lita and I chatted earlier, and if you all can send your proposed suggestions to Krista by next Monday. I know Monday is technically a holiday, but by the end of the day, Monday, just to give everyone time, we'll try to pull those together and come back at next Tuesday's meeting with the list of questions, and then we'll block out time to walk through those a little bit and for you all to give us direction. And it can be either the questions that we put in the written materials or the question that you ask as part of the interview panel. That's all up to you all how you want to approach that. That's step one. We are continuing with comprehensive training programs that foster understanding and promote values for our staff, elected and appointed officials. And I don't have anything specific at the moment, but that is part of the DEIB program that we are building out. And we never intended the initial training that everyone got to be the end of that process. There's a lot more to go on that. And we are continuing to have that conversation internally about what and where makes sense. We have at our website to include all the educational materials and presentations from those prior trainings, as well as other resources to encourage further community engagement on DEIB. So you can find those on our website. We will be addressing the best approach to address a similar occurrence like this in boards, commissions, and council meetings. Chatted a little bit with Carrie about that, about what we can do. It's kind of not really parliamentary procedure. It's a little bit more situational. So we're going to come up with something where we can give some guidelines for ways to approach that. And we will provide training for council's boards and commission members to find the appropriate way to offer public comment during a meeting. So that everyone understands that it's something different than just part of the regular meeting process. So we're committed to trying to learn from the incident and to move forward and strengthen our processes and procedures to make sure that we continue to be a welcoming for all community. And so those are the starting points of what we're going to do. Won't be the ending point, but want to make sure and address that up front, because this is important for the community and for council, I heard very clearly. So I went over opening up the interview process. I think we would see that being open for 2 weeks. And so the recruitment ending just before the 4th of July holiday, and then we would be coming back to you likely on July 11th for interviews and appointments. Separately, I want to remind the public that City Hall is closed next Monday, June 19th, in honor of Juneteenth. And we have some materials on our website, and social media information went out tonight so that everybody can read up and understand what Juneteenth is and why it's important to take time to observe it. And finally, I would like to invite the entire community to join us for a town hall on Tuesday, June 27th, about the town center plan and what projects are planned or are in progress. And there's a lot going on. So Tuesday, June 27th, right here in City Hall. It will be both in the chambers and out in the hallway. It is sort of a combination open house and town center. And looking forward from 5:30 to 8. Thank you, Councilmember Howe. I'm trying to look at everyone and read at the same time. Clearly, I'm not doing so well. And all that information is on our town center page on the city website. If you just go in and Google, not Google, but use the search function and type in town center, it'll take you right to that page. And all that information is there as well. We will be doing social media pushes as well and on the main page to help let everyone know about that. So with that, thank you, Mayor.
Great. Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I will be attending a Public Issues Committee meeting tomorrow. There are 4 main topics on the agenda. 2 are updates. One is the Regional Homelessness Authority 5-year plan that was adopted June 1. There will still be an update. And an update on the 2024 sewer rates, which is going to be increasing 5.7%. We'll be getting an update. And we will be having a discussion on Metro's plans to reduce bus service by 5% in September 2023. And this is new for discussion is King County Metro provides resources for helping cities update their comprehensive plans. This is to ensure that our land use, transportation plans, and policies align with Metro's planned transit service. So we'll be having a discussion on that. Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, we had a EFR meeting this week, and it was very good. We got a presentation on the Core Connect program, which was really exceptional. For those who don't know, it's an additional service that residents can be referred from firefighters who've been on calls for additional follow-up services. So the biggest types of calls that get followed up on or get referred are folks who've fallen and who might need additional assistance and care in their home or help or things like that. It's a great program, not only because it serves the community so well, but they've now been in operation long enough that it's something that they have started to be able to help people, and we reduce those follow-on calls because, for example, people who may fall, they might not just fall once and they call over and over again, but by getting Core Connect involved and getting them the actual services that they need, it reduces those later calls. So really exceptional service, really excited to see that, the amount of data that they now have and the analysis that they're gonna do on that. So I think that was kind of the highlight of the meeting. And that was Councilmember Howe and I, and then last night, Councilmember Howe and I were at a presentation called One Pill Can Kill. It was put on by the DEA and the Sammamish Police Department. I want to say it was a good presentation. It was hard. It was a hard presentation, but it's really important. So for anyone out there in the community, particularly parents of teens, talk to your teens. 6 out of 10 pills that are purchased on the street are laced with fentanyl. There was a picture of a little speck of fentanyl on the tip of a pencil. That is all the amount of fentanyl that has to be in a pill to kill. It is really, really scary. So talk to your kids, make sure that you know what's going on with your kids. Remember that Sammamish has provided some additional mental health services. So if you feel like you've seen a change in behavior in your kids or they're depressed, get them the help they need, please. I know at East Lake or Lake Washington School District, and I don't know if Issaquah, but on the back of their school IDs, there's information on resources where they can find help. So it was a very good presentation. They're going to try to put it on again in the fall at the start of the year. And I would highly encourage folks to come. We have flyers here, and I'll be handing them out at or I'll have them at the farmers market tomorrow as well. And don't forget to come to the farmers market tomorrow. Thank you.
Councilmember Howe?
There's also a direct correlation between depression and drug use. And so that was something from Core Connect. They said that they had an increased call level from Sammamish with youth. So that's a cautionary note, and it ties directly back to the fentanyl topic we just had. Tomorrow I'll be attending an EMAC meeting, which is the Emergency Management Advisory Board, and I'm running the caucus. I just wanted to let the city manager know that I think this is something Ryan might want to attend. We have a communications subgroup, and it's how to communicate and when to communicate. So if he wants to reach out to me, I can give him all the information on that.
Great. Lastly, I wanted to mention I went to East Lake's GSA meeting last Wednesday, just happenstance for timing. And then Friday, I was invited to Carol Nicholson's first grade class at Blackwell Elementary, where they told me all about the history of Sammamish. So it was really great. They're super cute, and like first graders are now my new favorite. So I think we're there, unless anyone else has anything. Councilmember Treen?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, thanks, everybody.